Руки вище, по одному не штовхаємось. Є. Дивись під ноги, Коля, слизька.
Далі, швидше рухаємося.
Руки за голову, не в кишені.
Поняв, колона туди, добро.
Ukraine broke Russia's offensives in Pokrovsk and Myrnorod. Morale and strategic control completely shifted.
Before dawn broke, a single piece of news emerging from Ukraine sent shockwaves through the geopolitical landscape. It was announced that the Russian army's advance on the Pokrovsk front had been halted. This was not merely a military statement, but a restoration of moral superiority. Because sometimes the fate of a war is determined not by territory, but by belief and perception. Ukraine is no longer just defending, it is proving that it can win. With this announcement, Western capitals once again saw Ukraine's unwavering determination. But in Moscow, the echoes of this news were far from expected. Whispers spread through the dark corridors of the Kremlin that discomfort was growing, and commanders no longer knew how to report the situation. Because saying "we stopped" often marks the end of a career in the Russian system. Pokrovsk had been one of the key objectives Russia had poured all its weight into in recent months. The fall of this city would have given Russian propaganda a major advantage. But now the opposite has happened. Ukrainian soldiers, with a will forged from concrete, not only stopped the enemy while defending the city, they shattered Russia's myth of invincibility. Western analysts interpreted this development with a striking assessment. The success gained in Pokrovsk has completely changed the psychological front line of the war. Those who lose the psychological battle are doomed to lose the field. Moscow is now struggling to maintain both the confidence of its soldiers and the belief of its people. Because even a lie repeated endlessly collapses the moment truth emerges. A notable phrase appeared in Ukraine's official statements. Russian units were forced to withdraw in some areas. The sentence is simple but powerful, because a withdrawal carried out not as a tactic, but as a necessity reveals great weakness. The bridgehead positions established by Russian forces for their advance collapsed. The streets surrounding the city are under full Ukrainian control. Every trench, every position is part of a larger plan. This success is the product of military discipline and command competence. Since the war began, Ukraine has continued to learn, and every painful loss has produced a stronger response. Pokrovsk is the latest example of this evolution. The northern line of the city has become today the clearest symbol of Ukrainian resilience. And behind this symbol lies extraordinary engineering. The streets have been turned into a labyrinth. When Russian armored vehicles attempt to advance, they fall into crossfire. Infantry is watched at every step, and Ukraine's maneuvering defense units gain a major advantage. Here, the Ukrainian army has built its fortifications not only into the earth but into its intellect. The rule of urban warfare is simple. The army that wins is not the bigger one, but the smarter one. Russian armored units made multiple attempts in this area, but not a single move succeeded. Heavy vehicles became trapped in narrow streets, unit cohesion broke down, and coordination problems resurfaced once again. Urban warfare cannot be conducted with doctrines learned for open fields. The Russian army has been trying to decipher urban warfare for years, but it is always too late against Ukraine's rapid adaptation. This situation has led to moral erosion among soldiers. A line from the radio recording of one Russian operation team sums up the reality. We're not driving a tank in here. We're entering a death trap. Ukrainian officers commanding the field are not employing a mentality of total defense, but rather selective resistance. This means every step has a meaning. Behind each position lies the next planned defensive line. The more Russia attacks, the deeper it sinks into a swamp. The reconnaissance technologies used by Ukraine now do more than detect. They help predict when the enemy will attack. The real-time data provided by drones keeps planning dynamic. And this means the Russian army has no chance of creating surprise. The Pokrovsk front is not only a defensive epic, it is also a diplomatic message. The world can now see clearly. Ukraine is not wasting the support it receives. Every system provided by the West is showing its impact on the battlefield. This strengthens the resolve of its allies. Support increases success. Success increases support. It is a cycle, but one that works in Ukraine's favor. For Russia, the opposite is true. The more they lose, the more they feel compelled to attack, and the more they attack, the heavier their losses become. This arithmetic determines not the victor, but the side that is exhausted. In the past 24 hours alone, the Russian army has launched a total of 49 assault attempts around Pokrovsk. This figure alone shows the desperation-driven aggression of Russian commanders. But every single attempt was repelled by Ukrainian defense. For Russia, this doesn't reflect military capacity. It reflects military loss. Because each failed assault creates a growing logistical burden. A failed attack does not simply end that attack. It weakens all future ones. The more Russia pushes, the more it drains its own strength. Serious questioning has now begun inside Russia. Among soldiers, the thought, "We don't even know why we're here anymore," is spreading. This is the greatest collapse an army can experience, the loss of purpose. When motivation is replaced by obligation, the will to fight disappears. There is reliable information indicating an increase in desertion cases. Such moral breakdowns create cascading effects on the battlefield. When one soldier fears, the one next to him becomes uneasy. Every step backward triggers another, and no propaganda can cover up the truth unfolding in the field. The most frightening situation for Russia is this. They are no longer the attacking side. They are fighting merely not to retreat. Because once they start pulling back, even they do not know where that withdrawal will stop. Ukraine, however, is acting more controlled, more planned, and more strategic. In this war, victory is not achieved simply by being strong, but by remaining strong at the right moment. Ukraine is fully aware of this truth, and every move it makes reflects that awareness. Another impact of the Pokrovsk battle is the psychological pressure mounting over Moscow. The Kremlin has long repeated the message, "We are advancing." Yet if anything is advancing, it is the graph of defeats. Regardless of what propaganda screens show, what is spoken inside the army is far harsher. Assault plans are collapsing one by one, and new plans are built on the ruins of old mistakes. This is unsustainable. The more Russia loses in the field, the more pressure grows at home. The soldiers lose on the ground. The policymakers lose at the table. A commander from the Ukrainian Defense Forces summarizes the situation as follows. "Every meter here is a value for us and a loss for them." The meaning is simple but powerful. Even Ukraine's stones are strategic, while Russia's tanks are defenseless, because a soldier standing in the right place will forever stop armor advancing from the wrong place. Pokrovsk is the clearest proof of this. Ukraine's success here will be studied in future military doctrines. Small units, high coordination, smart logistics, and constant data flow. The new name of war is flexibility. As Russia increases the intensity of its attacks, it exposes its own vulnerabilities. Being a large army is not always an advantage. Large armies have large problems. Command becomes fragmented. Operational plans become sluggish, and small mistakes turn into enormous losses. This is exactly what has happened in Pokrovsk. Moscow is now facing a new question. Not, how many troops should we send? But, where will we find more troops? The economic burden of this war is shaking Russia deeply. As resources deplete and the front expands, domestic unrest grows. The conclusion is stark and undeniable. Ukraine did not merely stop an assault at Pokrovsk. It destroyed an entire strategy. Russia now knows that the more it attacks, the more it will lose. Yet it also sees that it has no alternative left. This deadlock is the sign of the most dangerous phase of the war. A cornered army becomes its most vulnerable form. Ukraine, on the other hand, has gained confidence, applying its plans with greater boldness. The winner of this clash is not just soldiers, but the will of a nation. The world is now looking at Ukraine through a different lens. This country is not merely defending territory, it is fighting against time. Its resilience, its resistance, its collective mind, all converge on the battlefield. The victory in Pokrovsk may only be the beginning. This is not propaganda, this is reality speaking. Ukraine is not just stopping the enemy, it is stopping their advance. And this influence is now spreading across every front of the war. But the real story is only beginning. Because right next to Pokrovsk is another city, Mirnohrad. If this city had fallen, Pokrovsk would have been isolated. Russia had tied its plans to this point. But once the truth of what happened there came to light, people began to understand why the Kremlin has remained so silent. And now everyone is asking the same questions. What was the real fracture on the Mirnohrad line? Why was the Russian army suddenly pushed back? What wave of panic now awaits Moscow? Following the major shock created by the collapse of Russian assaults in Pokrovsk, all attention shifted to the critical defensive line just west of the city, Mirnohrad. Russia's plan was simple, yet unrealistic. If Mirnohrad fell, Pokrovsk would be isolated, and Ukraine's entire regional defense architecture would collapse. But what war planners crafting strategies on paper never calculate is this. The will of this land is drawn not by calculation, but by conviction. Mirnohrad, like a shield, protected not only itself, but Pokrovsk as well. And the shield did not break. It was the dreams of Russian command that shattered. Russian forces concentrated immense power on this area. Tank battalions, motorized brigades, supporting air elements, all directed at the same target. But this massive assault was not driven by strategy. It was driven by panic. The timing of the attacks was inconsistent, coordination between units weak, communication within the operation disrupted. Because every order given in haste creates more chaos on the field. This is exactly what unfolded around Mirnohrad. The more Russia applied pressure, the more disorganized it became. The more they attacked, the stronger Ukraine grew. This region was not merely a military point for Ukraine. It was the lifeline of logistics. New ammunition routes were opened, evacuation roads secured, and mobile units kept fresh through constant rotation. Ukrainian command elevated the art of dynamic defense to its peak here, where each unit would stand, how long it would hold, from which point a counterattack would be launched. Every detail was planned. Ukraine implemented here the sum total of all the experience it has gained throughout the war. Against such professional planning, the collapse of Russia's assault was inevitable. Russia, however, lost the fundamental logic of its offensive. They began attacking not to advance, but to avoid losing more ground. This marks the turning point of the war. They became not the side advancing, but the side exhausting itself. Mirnohrad was not the first place where Russia suffered a breakdown, but now it is the place where they suffered the hardest blow. Because this is not merely a military defeat, it is a strategic collapse. When a plan collapses, a new one can be made. But when a doctrine collapses, the entire war is thrown into question. Even during the darkest hours of the clashes, Ukrainian units never lost discipline. Using night vision systems, anti-drone tactics, and radar-supported infantry movements, Mirnohrad became a living defensive organism. The Russian side, however, made more mistakes as the difficulty of night operations increased. Signal interference, risks of friendly fire, and loss of orientation. In military literature, these are called fragile army reactions. It means unit order breaks down, and that breakdown quickly turns into a chain of panic. This is exactly what happened in Mirnohrad. As Russian units approached the gates of Mirnohrad, they were confronted with a brutal truth. Ukraine was not retreating. This is a devastating blow to morale, because Russian propaganda has always relied on one narrative. Eventually, Ukraine will tire and give up. Yet today, the opposite is happening. It is Russia that is exhausted, and Moscow's command that is being forced to concede. Sometimes the truth of war is hidden in a single sentence. As one Ukrainian soldier said, "We are not just defending this city, we are defending our future." Ukraine's greatest strength is its ability to learn immediately when it makes a mistake. After every attack, tactics are rapidly updated. Even within the same day, new forms of maneuver are put into action. This is what flexibility means. The Russian army, however, cannot adapt to innovation due to its rigid structure. Its chain of command is slow, reporting is delayed, and operational decisions are centralized. This kills the initiative of soldiers on the ground. This is one of the biggest differences between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine takes action, Russia waits for orders. Mirnorad has not fallen and will not fall, because every bomb dropped here only increases Ukraine's determination. Russian attacks backfire, casualties grow, soldiers become afraid, and this fear spreads quickly within military units. The burning of a tank is not merely the loss of a tank, it forces the soldiers nearby to ask themselves, "Am I next?" This is the moment when psychological warfare is won. When defeat begins in the enemy's mind, you win the war. But the war is not being determined solely by the front line. The conflict is now reaching deep inside Russia itself, because an event that occurred today has made everything even more chaotic. Even Russia's own cities are becoming increasingly dangerous. The explosion heard over Belgorod was the first real warning aimed at the Kremlin, and the truth behind this explosion shows how much control Russia has lost. A sentence Russia did not even want to imagine is now being spoken openly by everyone. The Russian army bombed its own territory. The bomb that fell in Belgorod was not just a piece of ammunition, it was the collapse of a regime's reputation. People poured into the streets, electricity was cut, information flow stopped. Propaganda channels remained silent for a while because they did not know what to say. Some claim the pilot panicked, others that the radar command collapsed, or that morale has deteriorated so severely that even flight safety can no longer be ensured. Regardless of which explanation is true, the result is the same. Russia cannot even protect its own people. This incident proved to the entire world that the war is not confined to Ukrainian territory. Trust in Moscow is decreasing. The question, why are bombs exploding in our own skies, is turning into a nightmare for the Kremlin. How long can people swallow fear? The answer to that question will now determine the fate of the Russian leadership. The number of bombs falling along the Russian border has exceeded 133, and this is only what has been recorded. In November alone, 8 explosions occurred in just 11 days. This is no longer a simple chain of mistakes. It is proof that military control has collapsed. If an army cannot protect its own country, how can it win in another? Even Putin cannot answer that question. Every meter gained in Pokrovsk shakes a general's seat in the Kremlin. Because one day, these failures will be accounted for. And when that day comes, no one will want to be at that table. The conclusion is this: Ukraine is winning both on the battlefield and psychologically. Russia is losing both on the battlefield and at home. This war is heading toward a turning point, and the Pokrovsk victory may be the beginning of that turning point. But for now, everyone is focused on the same question: can this collapse be stopped? Or has Ukraine's success in Pokrovsk become the real breaking point for Russia? Only one question remains: what happens now? Russia attacks, but the ones retreating are still them. They drop bombs, but the ones exploding are their own cities. And in this equation, the winner is clear: Ukraine's resolve. While the Pokrovsk front shatters Russia's hopes, the real impact of the war is now being felt in Moscow. For a long time, the Kremlin dictated the message, "We are advancing," to its own people, but it can no longer support this narrative, because advancement is a result, and results are based on what happens on the ground. And today, the only truth is this: the more the Russian army loses, the more it attacks. The more it attacks, the more it collapses. This contradiction now sits at the heart of Russia's war strategy. Ukraine is not using its success in Pokrovsk only to protect territory, but also to strip away the morale of the enemy. The discussions in today's closed briefings inside Russia are far darker than what the Kremlin shows publicly. A cycle of blame has begun among admirals, generals, and Politburo members. Some argue the failure stems from faulty intelligence, others blame field commanders. But no one dares to say the real truth. This war plan has been wrong from the beginning, underestimating Ukraine, belittling its determination, ignoring the resolve of its supporters. These were Russia's greatest strategic mistakes, and the price of these mistakes is now being paid every day. The most serious problem of the Russian army is no longer the depletion of its strength, but the collapse of its unit cohesion. Reports indicate that every front is experiencing internal disconnect. The chain of command, which is supposed to symbolize military discipline, has surrendered to panic-driven decisions. Coordination errors between units are turning into fatalities on the battlefield. This is one of the greatest consequences of Ukraine's effective resistance. Because inflicting losses on the enemy brings not only physical damage, but also a psychological blow. One area where Ukraine feels the strongest support is the United States' strategic assistance. Following this victory, Washington delivered an even clearer message. Ukraine can win and will win. This is not a wish. It is a strategic assessment based on observations from the ground. Every radar system, every air defense platform, every piece of ammunition sent by the United States makes Ukraine's resistance more controlled and more lethal. This is the equation Russia fears most. A superpower is not only supporting Ukraine, it is preparing Ukraine to win. Western analysts are now openly stating this. The Pokrovsk victory is not simply a military pause, but the beginning of a psychological unraveling. Because as Russian soldiers experience failure on the battlefield, their hope of returning home weakens. They know that when they return to Russia, they will not be treated as heroes. In the streets, the question, "Why is this war continuing?" is being asked more loudly. And for an authoritarian regime, the most dangerous thing is for the people to see the truth. The explosion of Russia's own bomb in Belgorod shattered this illusion. The most concrete example of the collapse within soldiers' morale is desertions. Many Russian soldiers now withdraw when they find an opportunity, abandon their units, or surrender, because the war has lost its meaning for them. How can a soldier fight for something he does not believe in? Ukrainian soldiers defend their homeland, their families, their cities, their identity. Russian soldiers are trapped inside a mistake. You cannot defend something you do not believe in, and where belief dies, armies die too. Another effect of the Pokrovsk victory is the strengthening confidence among Ukraine's allies. In European capitals, the idea Ukraine can hold this war is no longer a belief, but a reality. And this signals a new wave of support, because those who receive support win. Those who prove victory receive even more support. This cycle works in Ukraine's favor. Russia, on the other hand, becomes more isolated the more it loses. On the international stage, the perception that Russia is weakening grows stronger. Russia's entire goal was to take critical points like Pokrovsk and force Ukraine to the negotiation table. But today, the picture has completely changed. If there is a side that will be forced to the table, it is Russia itself. Because the longer the war continues, the greater the economic burden and public dissatisfaction become. As pressure grows, the Kremlin gravitates toward sharper decisions, but most of those decisions lead to even greater losses. When strategy is replaced by domestic political calculations, the war is lost. That is exactly what Russia is experiencing today. Map analyses of the clashes around Pokrovsk show that the Russian army is fighting not to advance, but to avoid encirclement. This is a sign of command paralysis. Military academies teach a simple truth. Retreat in war is a maneuver. Retreat made in panic is the beginning of rout. Russia is now facing panicked retreats, and the scale of these retreats grows every day. Ukraine's strategy is built on creating major impact with small forces. Each defensive cell is independently developed. When an attack intensifies at one point, Ukrainian forces reinforce that point before it falls. This cycle pushes the Russian army into a dead end. They cannot advance, cannot withdraw, they only lose. Meanwhile, Ukraine uses every weapon given to it at the right place and at the right time. This professionalism is clear evidence that Western support is paying off on the battlefield. When you look around Pokrovsk today, you can see broken tank hulls, burning armored vehicles, and ammunition crates abandoned in panic. These are not just military losses, they are traces of collapse. In war, the more traces an army leaves behind during its withdrawal, the faster it is fleeing. Russia is expanding these traces every day. Ukraine, on the other hand, even when it appears not to advance, is actually gaining time. Gaining time is one of the most critical steps of winning a war. Another reason unrest is creeping into Moscow is that the Russian population now realizes that even the Belarusian border is no longer safe. Every explosion, every reported injury creates new cracks in the empire of fear the Kremlin has built. A regime stands by fear. But if fear changes direction, it returns like a boomerang and strikes its owner. Today, the fear of the Russian people is turning into a threat for the Kremlin. Because when fear becomes uncontrollable, it turns into anger. Ukraine's victory is being achieved not only with military power on the ground, but also with the power of information. Every recorded radar image, every document, every field report appears in international media as evidence. The wall of lies built by Russia is being torn down by Ukraine's truths. This is not a propaganda war. It is a war for the survival of truth. And the side of truth is clear. Now everyone is asking the same question. Can Russia stop this collapse? Or has the Pokrovsk victory become the turning point that permanently changed the course of the war? Analysts are now more confident in saying, yes, this is a turning point, because after every critical battle, Russia lost power. Ukraine gained power. There is no reason for the outcome of such an equation to change. A soldier once said, "We hold here because this is our home." For Russian soldiers, however, these lands are not a home. They are an operational zone. This is where the difference in victory begins. A defender becomes stronger when he has something to lose. Ukraine knows it has much to lose. That is why it never steps back. Strategic comparisons can be made more openly today. Ukraine's psychology is strong, its public support high, its technological adaptation superior, its alliance network solid. In Russia, the situation is the exact opposite. The public is questioning, technology is lagging, command is weak, diplomatic isolation is growing. This picture interprets the war not only through territory, but through the future. And when all these conditions come together, the resulting reality is this: Ukraine is winning this war not only for today, but for tomorrow. Russia is fighting only to save today. The Ukrainian flag flying over Pokrovsk today is not just a color, it is a symbol of hope, resistance, and victory. As long as that flag flies, the outcome of this war is inevitable, because no force can make a nation abandon its own land. But the biggest question still awaits an answer. After this victory, what decision will Russia make? Will it attack even more, or sit on this failure and face the truth? Whatever path the Kremlin chooses, Ukraine is now the game maker. Here is the truth. Russia attacks, but the ones retreating are still them. They drop bombs, but the ones exploding are still their own cities. They draw up strategies, but the plans that collapse are theirs. And now it has become clearer than ever who will win this war in the end. Do you think Moscow can stop this collapse? Or has the Pokrovsk victory become the decisive turning point for Ukraine? Share your thoughts in the comments. We follow the truth together. Don't forget to subscribe. The recent explosion in Grafivka in the Belgorod region has become one of the most striking developments, showing that Russia is losing control not only on the battlefield, but even within its own territory. Reports from the area confirm that a piece of ammunition launched toward Ukraine malfunctioned mid-air and detonated inside Russian borders. when the timing of the explosion coincided with the detection of UAV activity in the area, the incident ceased to be merely a technical malfunction. It became a clear indicator of the weakness in the Russian army's command and control system. In the modern battlefield, air operations derive their value not only from striking capability, but also from the secure management of that strike, and it is evident that Russia has completely lost this balance. The location of the explosion was right near a hydroelectric facility in the region. Personnel and workers in the area were shaken by the loud detonation. 3 public and several regional facilities sustained damage. Although Russian officials tried to downplay the scale, the emerging visuals clearly confirm the power of the ammunition and the magnitude of the danger. As Russia increases the tempo of its attacks on Ukraine, the internal pressure created by these attacks on its own security domain rises proportionally. What happened today is not merely a piece of aerial ammunition going out of control. It is a concrete alarm showing that the Kremlin cannot fully command even its own weapon systems. What makes this picture even more striking are the official data. Throughout 2024, Russian aircraft accidentally dropped ammunition on their own territory or on temporarily occupied Ukrainian regions 159 times. Even this was a major problem in terms of military discipline. But in just the first 3 months of 2025, the number has reached 127 new incidents. In other words, the error rate is multiplying. The fact that such accidents occur so frequently, even during the most intense phases of the war, shows that logistical chaos is growing, pilot command coordination is weakening, and the Russian military lacks the technical infrastructure to manage the intensity of its own attacks. This is not merely an internal issue. It represents a major advantage for Ukraine on the battlefield. Because the more Russia intensifies its attack plans, the greater its loss of control becomes. Moreover, the ammunition that exploded was not an ordinary bomb, but one of the modern guided systems with high explosive power. Reports indicate that since the beginning of the year, Russian aircraft have used more than 120 high explosive munitions and 7 UMPB glide-guided munitions. Although these systems are designed for precision missions, the Russian military is increasingly unable to handle them safely, an issue now openly discussed in international military circles. Modern munitions require deep integration, strong radar linkage, and stable command coordination. But Russia today cannot maintain consistency in any of these 3 areas. This substantially increases the risk of munitions detonating uncontrollably inside Russia's own territory instead of reaching their target. From Ukraine's perspective, this situation produces 2 distinct advantages. First, psychological superiority. The fact that Russian-launched munitions fall back on Russia itself reveals that even the Kremlin's own offensive strategy cannot protect its internal security zones. This erodes public confidence within Russia, while boosting morale among Ukrainians. Second, operational advantage. Every uncontrolled Russian ammunition incident demonstrates how effective Ukraine's air defense and electronic countermeasure capabilities have become on the battlefield. While some Russian munitions fail due to technical malfunction, many experts highlight the role of Ukrainian electronic warfare systems. In other words, the Kremlin's current problem is not only its own mistakes, but also the natural outcome of Ukraine's advanced technological use. Another critical dimension of the incident is the damage it inflicts on Russia's strategic planning. In war management, the weakest link in the security chain collapses the reliability of the entire operation. For Russia, ammunition accidents are no longer exceptions. They have become part of the daily routine. This shows that Moscow's attack plans are spiraling into unpredictable chaos. The Russian army today cannot even manage the risks of the weapons it uses to pressure Ukraine. This entire picture is the clearest indication that the Kremlin's long-term war strategy is unsustainable. The conclusion is unmistakable. While Russia generates crises with its own munitions on its own territory, Ukraine advances on the battlefield through coordination and technical cohesion. This contrast becomes more pronounced every day. The explosion in Belgorod is just one example of this reality. Because the more Russia tries to generate offensive output, the more visible the disarray within its own systems becomes. And all indicators on the ground today say the same thing. The Kremlin continues tripping over its own shadow. One of the most critical developments on the Ukrainian battlefield in recent weeks has been the systematic neutralization of the BU and OSA air defense systems, long considered Russia's strongest defensive anchors in the region. This development is not the result of a single operation. It is the direct result of the transformation the Ukrainian army has undergone over the past 2 years, the way it integrates technology into the field, and its determination to apply modern warfare principles. The emerging picture today shows that Russia's claim of dominance in the skies has completely lost its validity. In the latest footage, the operation conducted by the Lasar Group of the Ukrainian Ground Forces 27th Mechanized Brigade is clearly visible. The BU and OSA systems represented two highly important layers in their respective domains. The BU family served a critical role in medium-range defense, while OSA systems protected important facilities through rapid short-range reaction. But Ukraine's newly developed operational structure, its reconnaissance superiority via UAVs, the close engagement capability of FPV drones, and the precise coordination of artillery batteries, left these systems effectively exposed. The BU family, which Russia has boasted about for years, is a platform developed since the Soviet era. Although the M1, M2, and M3 variants theoretically offered mobility and flexible radar capabilities, this flexibility became meaningless in the face of Ukraine's new generation detection chain built around unmanned systems. According to independent field reports, more than 90 BU systems have been disabled in various operations since the start of the war. This figure reflects not only Russia's battlefield losses, but also its complete loss of control over its medium-range defense network. The situation with the OSA system forms the second pillar of this collapse. Once effective in multiple regions due to its short-range and rapid reaction structure, OSA has become inadequate for modern warfare due to the rapidly evolving maneuverability of contemporary UAVs, its weak electronic protection systems, and limited radar resolution. Ukraine's drone artillery integrated operational model eliminates OSA's detection window entirely. Today, at least 60 OSA platforms are assessed to have been removed from the battlefield, and Russia lacks the production capacity to replace these losses. The neutralization of these two systems creates three major consequences in Russia's air defense architecture. First, the layered air defense chain breaks. Russia's air defense doctrine consists of three main layers: short, medium, and long range. The consecutive losses of BU and OSA create a major vacuum in the sky and open new corridors for Ukrainian UAV operations. Second, the mobility of Russian units on the ground decreases. Units without air defense remain at risk across larger areas. This makes it harder for Russian armored formations to reposition and leaves logistical movements more vulnerable. Third, Ukraine's operational level air superiority becomes reinforced. The Lasar Group's success is not merely a tactical destruction, it reflects Ukraine's progress in modern warfare. The combination of UAVs, reconnaissance elements, and artillery coordination is now dismantling Russia's defensive architecture piece by piece. An army whose air defense collapses naturally loses battlefield resilience. A power unable to control the sky cannot conceal or protect its ammunition depots, armored units, or command centers, nor can it maintain maneuver capability. Russia is now trapped at exactly this point. It lacks a modern production line to replace lost systems. Spare part flow is limited due to sanctions, and equipment from China is undergoing increasingly strict controls. Meanwhile, Ukraine gains a new advantage with every disabled system. As the sky clears, UAVs expand their operational range, artillery becomes more accurate, and ground unit coordination becomes safer. The future of the war is not being guessed. It is being calculated mathematically. The side whose air defense collapses falls behind. The side that controls the sky advances. For this reason, the destruction of the BU and OSA systems is not merely a military incident. It is a strategic turning point that will shape the coming months of the war. As Russia retreats defensively, Ukraine's technological superiority is redefining the battlefield. As military operations continue without pause along the Eastern European axis, one area behind the scenes of the battlefield is becoming increasingly decisive in shaping the war's true fate: logistical lines. Wars are not won solely with tanks, artillery, or drones. The timely delivery of ammunition, electronic components, medical supplies, and communication equipment to the right locations is an unseen but defining aspect of warfare. And today Russia is experiencing one of its weakest moments, precisely at this point. The tightened inspections imposed simultaneously by Chinese, Kazakh, and Russian customs authorities have brought nearly all of Russia's grey import supply mechanisms to a near standstill. This method had been the Russian army's critical backdoor since the start of the war. Chips used in UAVs, electronic sensors, medical kits, and energy components were being transported to Russia through Chinese and Central Asian routes. But now the borders have become not a passageway, but a bottleneck. Trucks are forming kilometer-long lines at Kazakhstan's entry points and Chinese border gates. Delays have reached up to 5 weeks, and this is not merely a transport issue. It directly translates into a loss of capacity on the battlefield. Russian volunteer organizations can no longer hide this situation. They openly announce on social media channels that the flow of aid has nearly stopped. The bottleneck in medical support equipment, in particular, seriously undermines the sustainability of Russian units on the field. Even tourniquets, medical support kits, and various medical components are being held at border gates. A volunteer's statement summarizes the situation. Miracles don't happen. If your money is the same and the price has doubled, you can buy half. This is the harsh reality of Russia's war economy. When we look at the technical dimension of the war, the picture becomes even more dire. Drone components, chips, and cameras, some of the most essential equipment for Russia to hold the front lines, are currently the biggest victims of disruptions in the supply chain. While the Ukrainian front has regular access to advanced UAV technology, it is becoming increasingly difficult for Russia to maintain the same capacity due to sanctions. Moreover, as Chinese manufacturers hesitate under US sanctions, the shipment of many dual-use products is considered risky, and companies are reluctant to send them. So, what does this situation mean? First, Russia cannot sustain its technological pace on the battlefield. Success in modern warfare depends not only on heavy weaponry, but also on data flow, sensors, the detection-correction chain, and electronic integrity. When even the smallest link in this chain breaks, operational coherence collapses. Second, the supply bottleneck limits Russia's rotation capability on the front. Equipment shortages in one region cannot be shifted to another because the logistics network is both expensive and slow. This allows Ukraine to create pressure points with precise maneuvers. Third, this crisis is not only a material shortage, but also a sign of geopolitical unraveling. Kazakhstan tightening its grey trade routes shows that Moscow's influence in the region is not as strong as previously thought. At the start of the war, Russia adopted the approach of "those with us will remain with us," but today, the situation has changed entirely. Fourth, delays are dealing a heavy blow to the morale of the Russian army. Units have to wait days for medical support and technical supplies. This directly weakens combat resilience and reduces the efficiency of offensive operations. And most importantly, Ukraine is carefully analyzing this situation and expanding its advantage. A logistics-strapped enemy, an army with slowed technological production, and a unit whose ammunition supply is interrupted cannot achieve long-term superiority. Conversely, Ukraine is increasing its resilience thanks to consistent support from Europe and the US, short delivery times, compatible ammunition structures, and high-tech infrastructure. The next phase of the war is no longer being written on the battlefield, but at the border checkpoints. This logistical congestion in Russia could visibly affect the front map in the coming weeks. The endurance capacity of the Russian army is not long-term. Ukraine, on the other hand, has already turned the rules of this endurance race to its favor. The military losses Russia is suffering on the battlefield can no longer be explained solely by frontline clashes. What is now challenging the Kremlin the most is the hidden side of the war, the major breakdown at the heart of the supply chain. Ukraine's technology-focused advance, combined with Western sanctions pressure and the changing positions of neighboring countries, is restricting Russia's maneuvering space. Especially simultaneous restrictions from China, Kazakhstan, and Russian customs have cut off the lifelines that provide oxygen to Moscow's most critical elements. This development signals not only an economic, but also a strategically direct military collapse. The thousands of trucks waiting at the Kazakhstan border represent not merely a logistics crisis, but a geopolitical transformation. The cargo inside these trucks is not ordinary commercial goods. They are the essential components keeping the Russian army operational on the battlefield. Drone parts, chips, thermal cameras, communication antennas, medical kits, energy modules, and electronic boards. Items that used to reach Moscow in a few days are now held at border crossings for weeks. The reason is still debated. Some argue that China is wary of US pressure, while others suggest that Kazakhstan is trying to maintain new balances with Europe. Whatever the reason, the result is heavy for the Russian army. No supply means no defense. Adding Russia's internal customs controls to this picture makes the crisis threefold. By tightening control, the Russian state mechanism slows its own import lines even further. Thus, borders are constricted from the outside, and bureaucratic obstacles increase internally. In such an environment, the war economy cannot be sustained. Every device, chip, and medical kit used on the front directly affects the operational sustainability of the units. A delay in any link of this chain paralyzes the entire system. This situation is being openly stated by Russian support groups. They report that soldiers can no longer obtain the equipment they need, Moscow warehouses are rapidly depleting, and domestic production is hampered by raw material shortages. We do not know who to blame, but we know what the consequences will be, say these support groups, summarizing in the clearest way the Kremlin's desperation. Pressure from the enemy on the battlefield can be controlled. Managing a war where the supply chain has collapsed is impossible. All of this creates a large strategic window of opportunity for Ukraine. The Ukrainian front not only monitors these developments, but shapes the rhythm of its operations around these breaking points. Drone production continues uninterrupted in Kiev, and logistical and technological support from the West secures its ammunition chain. Joint production projects with Europe and the US guarantee Ukraine's long-term sustainability. The winning side in war is not just the one with more ammunition, but the one that can continue to produce and replenish it. Today, that definition points to Ukraine. Russia, conversely, is dependent on external sources to maintain its production capacity. Most chips, cameras, processors, and sensors, the backbone of defense technologies, are imported. While this dependency may have seemed unproblematic in the early years of the war, it has now turned into a major deadlock due to China's cautious stance and the shifting foreign policies of Central Asian countries. The near cessation of electronic component flow is delaying repairs in Russia's air defense, slowing modernization of artillery systems, leaving UAV production lines idle, and weakening communication networks. The cumulative effect of all this is an army with reduced mobility on the battlefield, weakened defense infrastructure, and impaired ability to execute attack plans. Today, everyone is asking, is this crisis temporary, or is it the beginning of a period that will permanently weaken Russia's war capacity? Given the current conditions, the second scenario appears far more likely. This is not just a logistical disruption, it is the result of a multi-dimensional pressure mechanism. China is cautious, Kazakhstan is distant, Russian bureaucracy moves slowly, and Western sanctions grow more effective each month. Combined, these four factors gradually eliminate Russia's maneuvering space. This is precisely why Ukraine's strategic tempo is increasing. Kiev is gaining strength not only on the battlefield, but also diplomatically, seeing at every step how robust Western support is. As Russia's logistical lifeline tightens, Ukraine gains more space. The war is not only taking place on Ukrainian soil, security waves forming around the world directly affect the balance on the ground. Russia's military and logistical squeeze becomes even more pronounced as global powers position themselves. At this point, the steps taken by the US and Europe increase Kiev's resilience while sharply reducing Moscow's maneuvering space. Finally, a critical event in Haiti again illustrates how quickly Washington can respond to international security incidents and how determined it is to maintain global stability. The US Department of Defense confirmed that Marines stationed at the embassy complex in Port-au-Prince were targeted by irregular armed groups on the night of November 14th. This incident was recorded as one of the most critical security breaches directed at US diplomatic personnel this year. The US forces responded swiftly, regaining control without any personnel casualties. This rapid reaction demonstrates Washington's capacity to quickly manage global security risks. The Haiti example shows how broadly the US security perception extends worldwide, while also highlighting one reality: the democratic bloc does not remain indifferent to developments that undermine stability. This reflex is not merely symbolic support for Ukraine, it is one of the most important sources sustaining strategic resilience on the battlefield. The security policies adopted by the US and Europe function as part of a chain that does not leave Ukraine isolated. Although the tension in Haiti may seem unrelated to other regions, it demonstrates that the West is developing a coordinated approach to simultaneous security threats worldwide. Measures taken at Europe's eastern borders, responses to Russia's pressure mechanisms, and US actions in the Caribbean are all parts of the same security architecture. This global stance makes Moscow's regional power maneuvers increasingly risky and futile. Russia now faces not only Ukraine, but also an ever more coordinated West on the international stage. For Ukraine, this situation creates a critical advantage. Success in the war depends not only on military operations on the ground, but also on diplomatic solidarity, international pressure mechanisms, and security policies that directly influence Ukraine's performance. As Russia's supply chain collapses, steps to strengthen stability at Europe's eastern borders reduce the effect of pressure attempts along the Minsk line. Poland reopening border crossings adds a major geopolitical message to this picture. Eastern Europe is now more resilient, more stable, and more resistant to Russia's hybrid tactics. As this context rises, Ukraine's military and economic integration with the West grows stronger. Ukraine's air forces are being strengthened with modern platforms like the Rafale, and long-term support from the European defense industry forms the foundation of this new security architecture. In a war where air superiority is being redefined, the Zelensky administration is building the army of the future by approaching Western technology and training standards rather than relying on Russia. Modernizing the air fleet at this scale creates significant pressure on Russia, as the Kremlin now faces not an air force operating on Soviet relics, but a modern air power integrating with Europe. When combined with the US's decisive reaction in Haiti, the security measures taken at Europe's eastern borders, and France opening modernization opportunities to Ukraine, the emerging picture is clear. The West is now actively protecting every link of the global security chain. Ukraine, one of the most important links in this chain, continues to receive support not only on the battlefield, but also diplomatically and geopolitically. At this point, the message becomes stronger. Russia is isolating itself, while Ukraine occupies the center of a growing alliance. The logistical collapse and loss of international support that Moscow faces indicate long-term weakening, while Kiev becomes part of a more resilient, determined, and modern security architecture. Dear followers, what do you think? Do you believe this broad Western security reflex will further enhance Ukraine's advantage in the war? Share your thoughts in the comments and like our video to support Ukraine's rightful struggle. We will continue to bring you new developments moment by moment, wishing for the days when peace prevails to come soon. In the last 48 hours along the Black Sea line, a development has taken place that completely changed the rhythm of the war, a true turning point. With an operation that demonstrated the new level of its long-range capabilities to the entire world, Ukraine targeted the Sheskharis oil terminal on the Novorossiysk coast, one of the most critical energy hubs in southern Russia. For years, this facility had been described as one of Moscow's economic lungs, carrying nearly one-third of Russia's maritime oil exports. But the damage reflected in satellite imagery now reveals that this lung can no longer breathe regularly. In fact, it appears largely paralyzed. The loading arms rendered inoperative, severed pipelines, and wide disabled sections of the terminal have caused a profound rupture in a strategically vital portion of Russia's energy flow. For the Kremlin, this carries a clear strategic message. Ukraine's range capacity has reached a level that can now overturn Russian calculations. The most striking aspect of the operation, however, is that Ukraine did not target only an oil terminal. Within the same time window, another precise strike was carried out on the deployment area of the 1537th Air Defense Regiment, located near the terminal. This double blow demonstrates that Ukraine is now implementing a strategy in which complementary strikes suppress different layers of the adversary's defenses simultaneously. While the energy infrastructure was being knocked out, a clear message was also sent to the core of the region's air defense architecture. Russia's security ring around the Black Sea is no longer as tight as it once was. In fact, with each new Ukrainian operation, this ring is widening and weakening. This creates a multi-dimensional pressure environment that increasingly undermines Russia's southern defenses. Targeting the Novorossiysk line, an area Russia has valued for centuries, demonstrates that Ukraine is conducting this war not only on the battlefield, but also in the economic and psychological domains. Hitting an energy terminal does not simply halt the flow of oil. It sends a message to international markets that Russia's energy security is not as solid as presumed. Indeed, assessments released immediately after the operation indicate that Russia's export capacity will drop significantly in the short term, and that full repairs will require a lengthy process. This development strengthens Ukraine's hand in the economic dimension of the war, and the fact that the blow was dealt just as winter approaches is a factor that disrupts the Kremlin's revenue planning. Turning to the military aspect, the picture is no less dramatic. The operation conducted against the area where the 1537th Regiment was deployed created a significant gap in Russia's southern defense structure. This regiment formed one of the backbone elements of the air defense umbrella around Novorossiysk. The loss at this point confirms that one of the Kremlin's most trusted defense lines throughout the war has weakened. No matter how assertive Russia's presence in the Black Sea may appear, that presence is no longer as secure against Ukraine's new generation long-range capabilities. And this is precisely what makes the operation unique. Ukraine is no longer simply protecting its front line, it is demonstrating its reach into the enemy's rear areas hundreds of kilometers away. There is also a moral and psychological dimension. For years, Russia has insisted on projecting the perception that the southern line was secure and that Novorossiysk is untouchable. But the major damage at the Sheskharis terminal proves that this narrative no longer corresponds to reality. Even within Russia's domestic public sphere, debates have begun. How is Ukraine able to conduct such a deep penetration strike at this scale? That question alone reveals how severely the Kremlin's carefully constructed image of security has been shaken. Furthermore, the timing of the operation is noteworthy from a strategic perspective. In a period when winter conditions are approaching, a blow dealt to energy infrastructure will place pressure both on Russia's domestic management and its war economy. For this reason, the scale of the operation is recorded not merely as a tactical success, but as a major strategic move. Because this strike enabled Kyiv to send the following message to the world once again: Ukraine is no longer just a country defending itself, it is an active power shaping the regional equation. And this was only the opening phase of the operation. The real rupture comes now. The major loss suffered by the S-400 system, one of the fundamental pillars of Russia's southern defenses. Now we will break down, step by step, how this loss affected the battlefield, how it weakened the defensive grid, and how Ukraine turned this gap into an advantage. The most critical stage of that chain reaction night that began on the Novorossiysk coast was in fact not the strike on the oil terminal. The true strategic rupture occurred with the simultaneous operation targeting the S-400 battery that formed the backbone of Russia's southern air defenses. When energy infrastructure is hit, you suffer an economic blow, but when a long-range air defense system such as the S-400 is disabled, you begin losing control not only on the ground, but also in the airspace. That is precisely what Ukraine accomplished in this operation, piercing the air shield of a region where Russia believed it was safe, and doing so in a single night, visibly and decisively. Before the attack, satellite imagery showed that the S-400 system was protected by between 5 and 12 launchers. At least 7 of these launchers were active, as confirmed by open-source defense analysts. But the coordinated UAV operation planned by Ukrainian security units dismantled this massive system layer by layer. In the first phase, electronic jamming and guidance were applied. Then, low-altitude attack drones advanced toward the battery's blind spot. Within minutes, it was reported that one of the system's most critical components, the long-range radar, had been hit, causing its target detection capability to collapse. The rupture occurred at exactly this moment. Once the radar went silent, the S-400 ceased to be a long-range air defense system and became entirely non-operational in the field. In the second phase of the operation, Ukraine employed precision-guided munitions. In that brief window when the radar was offline, several strikes landed on the side zones where the launchers were located. According to the latest reports, 4 launchers were completely destroyed. It is assessed that the remaining ones were either damaged or had at least lost operational capacity. The meaning is clear. The S-400 line protecting the Novorossiysk area is now gone. The Russian Black Sea coast is now more fragile and permeable than ever before. The inaccessible zone image Moscow tried to project for years collapsed in a single night. To better understand the scale of this operation, one must look at the numbers. Independent defense organizations had confirmed approximately 19 S-400 losses throughout the war. In other words, in 3.5 years of conflict, Moscow had lost that many critical units. Ukraine's Novorossiysk strike, however, may have increased these losses by 20 to 30% in a single move. Such an outcome is extremely rare in the history of modern warfare, because the S-400 is not merely a battlefield asset, it is the centerpiece of Russia's national air defense doctrine. Losing it means not only losing a battery, but losing the image of deterrence. Even more concerning for Russia is the political and strategic value of the region in which this loss occurred. Novorossiysk is one of the main ports for the remaining elements of the Black Sea Fleet. After the major losses in Crimea, a significant portion of the fleet had been relocated here. Ukraine's ability to neutralize an S-400 at such depth not only weakens regional air defense, it also undermines the fleet's sense of having a safe harbor. From now on, all fleet activities will be under greater risk. More importantly, the likelihood of long-range unmanned systems targeting ships, depots, and infrastructure around the port will increase. A port with weakened air defense coverage becomes the ideal target for the next operation. From Ukraine's perspective, this operation proves that long-range capabilities are now decisive not at the tactical level, but at the operational level. A few months ago, such a deep strike would have been unimaginable. Today, Ukraine is able to hit Russia's command chain, radar network, and critical infrastructure hundreds of kilometers away. This demonstrates the success of intelligence and planning. Conducting a dual strike against both energy infrastructure and air defense in a single night means flawlessly applying the complex principles of modern warfare. Now the pressing question is, how will Russia compensate for this loss? The answer does not look promising in the short term. The S-400 production process is slow, costly, and logistically complex. Moreover, since the remaining systems must now be pulled back to protect Moscow and St. Petersburg, the defensive burden on the southern line has increased even further. The southern coast is no longer a rear area. It is an exposed front line vulnerable to Ukraine's long-range pressure. This picture is not just today's story, it signals a new phase that will shape the future course of the war. Now we will discuss how this weakened defense structure is transforming the southern front, its effects on Crimea and the North Caucasus, and the potential evolution of Ukraine's deep strike capabilities. The double strike in Novorossiysk did not merely hit a port and an S-400 battery. It exposed one of the most vulnerable points in Russia's southern defense fabric, the Kuban corridor. When the losses at the Sheskharis terminal and the 1537th Regiment occurred within the same time frame, this event ceased to be an isolated operation and instead turned into a chain reaction strategic unraveling. From Crimea to Rostov, and from there, deep into the North Caucasus, this wide region fell under the responsibility of Russia's 4th Air and Air Defense Army, a critical component of the multi-layered air shield model Moscow has promoted to the world. Yet over the past 3 months, this model has rapidly thinned under the pressure of Ukraine's growing long-range capabilities. Successive strikes on radar and air defense facilities in Crimea had already signaled the beginning of this collapse. Then, pinpoint operations on ammunition hubs and logistical nodes around Rostov forced Russia to withdraw certain air defense tiers from some areas. And this is precisely why the double blow in Novorossiysk was so effective. Russia had already been forced to compress its defenses, and Ukraine targeted the weakest point of this compressed corridor. The success of the latest strike at a depth of 430 to 450 kilometers declares a new reality. Ukraine now has the capacity not only to affect the front line, but also to strike at the heart of Russia's war economy and military coordination system. This range is far beyond classical artillery or short-range UAV operations. A deep strike of this magnitude is possible only through the integration of advanced munitions, satellite intelligence, electronic guidance, and Western-supported sensor networks working in unison. For this reason, the Novorossiysk attack is not merely an operation. It is a sign that Ukraine has entered a new phase in its war doctrine. To understand the situation Russia is currently facing, one must look not to the northern front but to its rear. Because the war is no longer won solely between trenches, but hundreds of kilometers beyond the border. The S-300 and S-400 losses in Crimea, the electronic warfare elements withdrawn from the Donbass line, the precision strikes on bases in Rostov. All of these events show that the southern defense is no longer a zone of concentrated power, but has turned into a corridor of weakness. After the rupture caused by the Novorossiysk attack, one of Russia's biggest vulnerabilities has become clear. Its defense capacity is no longer strong enough to be distributed evenly everywhere, and this means operational freedom for Ukraine. At this point, the difficulty Russia is experiencing is not only military, but also an economic and logistical problem. The Sheskharis terminal carried nearly 1/3 of Russia's seaborne oil exports. The disruption at this terminal directly affects Moscow's revenue flow. The simultaneous loss of an S-400 battery means that the defensive shield required to protect this flow has collapsed. In other words, the economic artery was cut and the military shield was broken. This dual loss is a form of strategic collapse rarely seen in the literature of war. The reason Ukraine's long-range capability created this chain reaction is that the attacks do not appear as isolated incidents. On the contrary, they function like interconnected chess moves. First, the radars are silenced, then port facilities are targeted, and afterwards command coordination centers are pressured. This simultaneously collapses both Russia's defensive tempo and its operational capacity. The weakening of the southern radar network immediately after the losses in Crimea opens new corridors for Ukraine. Ukraine can now diversify its attack directions, while Russia cannot determine which area to defend. Experts in the field have begun to call this effect a layered attrition doctrine. That is, a loss in one location leads to fractures in others. Indeed, after the Novorossiysk attack, Russia's decision to shift air defenses further inland caused the southern line to become even more fragile. If this pressure continues, Ukraine could have a much wider operational field during the winter months. The critical question remains, how will Russia close gaps spread across such a wide area all at once? Theoretically, new systems can be brought in, but in practice the time, cost, and risks of doing this cannot keep pace with the tempo of war. For this reason, experts state that if Ukraine continues to improve its long-range capabilities, Russia will struggle to restore stable defense in the south. Now, parallel to this picture, we will examine the emerging revolution in robotic ground systems, the battlefield impact of the TWW-12.7 ground robot, and how it is transforming Ukraine's land warfare. As the echoes of the deep operation in Novorossiysk continue, Ukraine is implementing another revolution on the ground, one that is quiet yet profoundly transformative. Robotic ground systems. Modern warfare is now being rewritten not only in the skies, but also on the soil. And one of the vehicles writing the first lines of this new page is the TWW-12.7 ground robot, used by the NC-13 unit of the 3rd Assault Brigade. The performance of this platform shows that Ukraine is directly transferring its innovative land warfare approach onto the battlefield. The story of this robot did not begin with a simple patrol mission. It was deployed for about 1.5 months with the task of holding a critical junction in a specific sector. The issue was not merely observing a position. The route controlled by the robot was at times the scene of Russian attempts to advance, and these attempts were not only for reconnaissance, but rather tactical infiltrations designed to probe the area and create gaps in the Ukrainian line. Despite being carried to the position every day and withdrawn each evening, the TWW-12.7 turned the area into part of a continuous defensive chain. During this period, it prevented several confirmed Russian advance attempts and kept the junction from falling, giving Ukrainian forces a strategic advantage. The reason the TWW-12.7 is so effective is not simply that it is a machine. It can deliver the immediate responses required by war without risking human life. Its 12.7mm class firepower, ground mobility, and the high level of visibility it offers operators carry it far beyond classical fixed weapon systems. More importantly, deploying the robot does not require complex infrastructure. It can be carried, positioned, and withdrawn by operators. This flexibility makes it an ideal solution for dynamic front lines. This technology is, of course, not limited to a single vehicle. The Ukrainian army is testing ground robots not only to protect defensive lines, but also for large-scale offensive planning. For example, work continues on a model in which multiple robots advance simultaneously, while operators manage them from a single center. If this method is successfully implemented, it could dramatically reduce risk, especially in intra-urban combat and narrow areas. Robots could conduct reconnaissance, open fire, and even force the enemy to retreat in areas where classical infantry units would normally advance. One of the most noteworthy aspects of these robots is their user-friendly interface. For someone starting from zero, operator training can take up to a month, while for experienced personnel, this period can fall to a week. In other words, the system is not only effective, but also rapidly scalable. This allows Ukraine to use its available manpower more intelligently on the front. Deploying robotic systems instead of personnel in high-risk missions is a major gain in both morale and operational efficiency. One of the defining characteristics of war is the capacity to adapt technologically. Whoever adapts faster, integrates new technologies first, and reshapes their operational doctrine accordingly gains superiority on the battlefield. In this regard, Ukraine has become the most creative actor in the war. After the drone revolution, it is now advancing at the same pace in ground robotics. Russia, however, is still lagging behind in this domain, and the prototypes it has deployed are not yet operationally viable. This gap could shift the dynamics of land warfare in Ukraine's favor as we enter 2025. At this point, an important question arises. How effective can this technology be in large-scale land operations? We have already begun to see the first answers on the battlefield. The fact that the TWW 12.7 held a junction for 1.5 months prevented a break in Ukraine's defensive chain. When these robots increase in number, the risk of human losses can be reduced while operational tempo increases, especially in areas with intense clashes. Ultimately, the TWW 12.7 is not just a machine. It is a symbol of Ukraine's determination to reshape the land front of the war. The future of modern warfare will no longer be defined by tanks, giant artillery pieces, or formations of hundreds of soldiers, but by smart, flexible, and low-risk platforms. And Ukraine is at the center of this transformation. Now we will explain how this military landscape intersects with the internal social and political tension inside Russia, why the Kremlin's rhetoric is increasingly disconnected from reality, and how the information war will reflect into the winter months. As the military situation on the ground shifts in Ukraine's favor, its reflections on Russia's domestic politics and social atmosphere are becoming more visible. Because a war is not conducted solely with tanks, drones, or long-range munitions on the front lines. It is also shaped by society's endurance capacity, psychological integrity, and the messages delivered by the state. For this reason, Russia's recent domestic debates are no longer merely social media posts. They are early signs showing that the Kremlin's war narrative is starting to crack. A post circulating on Russian social media platforms summarizes this picture strikingly. An individual shares information allegedly coming from someone close to them and states that they were given some form of state-backed compensation. The subtext of this statement reveals the silent questioning within society. What is this price really being paid for? While the Kremlin has for years repeated the narrative of a grand and swift victory, the reality coming from the front does not match this narrative. Losses are increasing, the process is dragging on, and the outcome is becoming uncertain. The Kremlin's attempt to cover this reality with propaganda language is losing effectiveness, because the cost of the war has now reached the doorstep of the public. One reflection of this psychological turbulence is the activity observed in Russia's border regions. Claims made by some Russian media outlets that the Ukrainian Air Force is withdrawing were quickly denied by Ukraine. In reality, what was happening on the ground was that Russian units were attempting risky maneuvers along the border using ATV-type light vehicles. This situation shows that Moscow is starting to lose dominance in the information war. Russian propaganda is now not only contradicting events on the ground, but is also becoming inconsistent with the behavior of its own security forces. Ukraine, meanwhile, is moving along a very different line. The country maintains its core objective clearly: defending its sovereignty. This objective delivers a consistent message to the international public, to Western allies, and to Russian forces on the ground. Modern air platforms, low-altitude pressure missions, robotic systems, long-range operations. All of these are not only military tools, but statements of will. The message Ukraine delivers on the ground is fully aligned with the message delivered at the diplomatic table: we will not retreat. The most critical part of this coherence is Western support. Thanks to the military, technical, and intelligence support provided by the US and Europe, Ukraine is not only defending, but also exerting strategic pressure deep inside Russia. This pressure will become even more pronounced as winter approaches, because winter has historically been a more challenging logistical period for Russia. Ukraine's long-range capabilities and developing robotic systems could make this period even more fragile for Russia. When all of this is combined, a very clear picture emerges. Russia is under pressure simultaneously on the battlefield, in domestic politics, and in the information war. Its economic arteries are being cut by port attacks, its defensive shield is weakened by S-400 losses, and its social endurance threshold is tested by rising casualties. Meanwhile, Ukraine is diversifying its long-range operations with the support of its allies, transforming land warfare with unmanned systems, and emerging as the actor best able to adapt to the rhythm of modern war. As winter approaches, the intensity of the information war will also increase. While Russia tries to suppress domestic unrest, Ukraine will reinforce its international support with each new success on the ground. This shift in balance may determine the direction of upcoming operations. When Russia's rhetorical pressure fails to cover the truth, societal questioning grows harsher and the political cost of the war increases. Ukraine, on the other hand, will be in a stronger position to turn every tactical success on the ground into strategic advantage. For our viewers, the most critical question is this: can Ukraine turn this wave of strategic pressure into lasting superiority? Experts say this is possible with the right support and the right tactical moves. From the energy blows in the Black Sea to the collapse of southern air defense, from robotic ground systems to superiority in the information war, all of these developments show that Ukraine has rapidly learned and redefined the language of modern warfare. What do you think? Do these developments signal an irreversible phase in the trajectory of the war? You can write your comments below and leave a like to support this broadcast. In the next report, we will continue to bring you the behind-the-scenes details of new operations, satellite analyses, and the latest situation on the front line. The recent developments on the Pokrovsk line clearly reveal that the Ukrainian army is no longer merely a defensive force, but a strategic actor that now determines the enemy's mobility on the battlefield. Russia has long attempted to increase pressure on the region by conducting sudden infiltrations with small units, using intermediate routes around the city to wear down Ukraine's defenses. Yet Kyiv's command has completely decoded this method. The latest operation is the clearest example of this transformation. The simultaneous air and ground strike that disabled the Selidov-Prosovsk connection road has deprived Russia of its most important personnel transfer corridor around Pokrovsk. The narrow passages and bridges along the route were rendered unusable by pinpoint strikes from Ukrainian aircraft, instantly eliminating the maneuver advantage of Russian light vehicles. This result does not merely signify the closure of a road. In modern warfare, every corridor is a lifeline, especially when it heavily influences micro-maneuver areas around the region. Russian units used this route to advance in small groups, catch Ukrainian defenses off guard, deploy quickly, and create new pressure points. Now, however, the situation on the ground has completely changed. Since this route is closed, Russian units are forced to move across wider, more exposed, and significantly slower paths. Advancing through such open corridors makes them far easier for Ukraine's surveillance network to track. In other words, what was once a tactical advantage for Russia has now turned into a radar corridor for Ukraine. The operation carried out by Kyiv's command is not only military, but also a strategic message. Around Pokrovsk, no infiltration attempt is a surprise anymore. Ukraine's sensor, drone, and reconnaissance infrastructure has expanded so much that Russia's small tactical groups are no longer an unexpected source of pressure. Instead, they have become predictable patterns that are easily detected and swiftly countered. That is why this latest Ukrainian move not only neutralized the Selidov-Prosovsk route, but also rendered ineffective the tactical approach Russia has been relying on for a long time. Local observation reports confirm that the tempo of clashes around the region has noticeably decreased following the operation. This means the following. Russia is now losing both territory and the freedom of movement it previously used to generate pressure. Ukrainian units are not only holding defensive positions, they are also clearing surrounding risk zones and reinforcing the defensive perimeter. For the Ukrainian forces defending the area, this development brings both operational and psychological relief, because every closed route eliminates one more potential infiltration. One of Russia's main problems is its dependence on logistics to maintain pressure. An offensive can only remain sustainable if backed by a strong support line. Ukraine's operation struck precisely at this critical point. If Russian forces want to rebuild intense pressure around Pokrovsk, they need a secure, rapid, and multi-directional supply corridor. Yet the reality on the ground today is clear. That corridor no longer exists. This directly affects Russia's ability to sustain offensive operations in the region. Because in modern warfare, attacking alone is not enough. The supporting flow behind the attack must also be secure. What Ukraine has done is strategically sever this chain. The conclusion is unmistakable. Ukraine is not just defending, it is setting the rules of the game. The latest operation around Pokrovsk narrows Russia's offensive planning while expanding Ukraine's defensive architecture. It is now possible to say that Russia has virtually no way to rapidly build pressure in this area. And as long as this situation remains unchanged, Ukraine will continue to strengthen its control step by step. But is this pressure limited only to the area around Pokrovsk? No. As we will see shortly, Ukraine is simultaneously conducting strategic operations deep inside Russia, targeting Moscow's war economy itself. While Ukraine was establishing pressure around Pokrovsk, a very different turning point emerged hundreds of kilometers away from the front line. Ukraine's long-range operational capability has begun reshaping the geography of the war, and the latest example was seen at the Lucille oil refinery in Volgograd. The pinpoint strike, carried out by Ukrainian-made LUTN-196 unmanned systems, exposed the gaps in Russia's deep defense layers. The weak response of Russian air defenses to the incoming drones was not simply a technical failure, it was a new sign of the growing security vulnerabilities in Russia's interior regions. The explosions that continued throughout the night created a noticeable disturbance, not only among military analysts, but also among residents inside Russia. The sounds of the blasts and the glow in the sky revealed that after years of war, Russia's defensive infrastructure in the hinterland remains fragmented and unprepared. Air defenses either detected the drones too late or engaged them directly above the city. This indicates a critical flaw in Russia's defense discipline. Waiting until the threat arrives is not an acceptable behavior in modern warfare, especially when the adversary possesses long-range, low-radar signature systems capable of altering direction mid-flight. This attack affects not only Russia's military infrastructure, but also its psychological balance. Moscow had long attempted to cultivate the idea that the country's interior regions were safe. However, Ukraine's increasingly advanced drone technology is systematically dismantling this perception. For Russia's interior, the notion of a safe zone is now becoming questionable. Observation reports noted the activation of air defense sirens in multiple areas, and videos circulating on social media showed defense traces streaking across the sky. Each explosion further cements the idea that the interior regions are no longer as protected as they once were. Ukraine's operation is far more than a strike on a refinery. Every blow to energy infrastructure directly impacts Russia's logistical capacity at the front. Refineries are the central nodes of fuel flow, and fuel is the foundation of every military mechanism, from tanks to logistics trucks, from generators to unmanned systems. Any disruption in this chain reduces Russia's mobility on the battlefield, especially at this stage of the war, where Russia still relies heavily on fuel-consuming heavy vehicles across vast territories. Furthermore, the platforms Ukraine uses during such operations confirm a point Western analysts have highlighted for a long time. Russia's deep air defense layers are not sufficiently resistant to multi-drone attacks. The fundamental reason is that these systems were primarily designed to counter large threats, especially high-altitude missiles and aircraft. But today's battlefield is shaped by low-cost, mass-producible, long-range drones. This new type of threat is challenging Russia's defensive doctrine and making the existing infrastructure more fragile with each attack. From Ukraine's perspective, the situation is the opposite. With Western technical support, Kyiv has rapidly advanced its domestic drone technology. Platforms like the LUTN-196 are concrete proof of this progress. After several years of R&D, Ukraine now possesses a strike range capable of reaching deep into Russia's interior regions. This expands the dynamics of the war. The battle is no longer limited to Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, or Kherson. It is also being fought at Russia's energy facilities, radar towers, and logistical hubs. Another important outcome of this operation is the following. Russia must now change its defensive planning. Without securing its interior lines, any offensive plan along the front becomes meaningless. Because in modern warfare, when the rear collapses, the front cannot hold. Ukraine is targeting precisely this point. Russia's energy facilities, supporting its war economy, its drone production infrastructure, and its logistical centers are now all on Ukraine's radar. All of this points to one clear conclusion. Ukraine is not merely protecting itself, it is shaping the enemy's warfighting capacity. The same strategic thinking that cut off movement corridors around Pokrovsk is also striking the refinery in Volgograd. This is no coincidence. It is a systematic strategy that reads like a lesson in modern warfare. And the effects of this strategy are only beginning to emerge. If you're ready, next we will examine the consequences of even larger scale operations targeting Russia's critical facilities. Ukraine's strike concept is now fully multi-layered, and its impact is shaping not only the present, but the overall direction of the war. The most striking capability Ukraine has developed in the third year of the war is not merely resisting at the front, but establishing an attack architecture capable of striking multiple targets located tens of kilometers apart inside Russia, all in the same night. The most critical developments of the week emerged within this multi-layered strike wave. The attack on the Ryazan oil refinery, the neutralization of the Nebo-U radar complex in Crimea, the strike on the military railway line near Tokmak, and the destruction of troop concentrations around Vovchansk. Each of these would have been a major operation on its own, yet Ukraine executed them within the same time window, reshaping the strategic landscape of the war. The damage inflicted on the Ryazan refinery was particularly significant. Refineries play a critical role in Russia's military logistics flow. They supply the fuel needed for tanks, armored vehicles, and supply convoys at the front. The destruction inflicted upon the refinery's processing units not only creates short-term disruptions, but also complicates logistical planning across Russia's vast geography. Fuel is the circulatory system of modern warfare, and any disruption in that circulation directly impacts the front line. This is why the blow to Ryazan is not merely industrial damage. It is a loss of strategic capacity. Within the same wave of operations, the strike on the Nebo-U radar complex represents an even more critical loss affecting Russia's air defense umbrella. The Nebo-U is capable of detecting high-altitude targets, tracking ballistic threats, and providing early warning data to regional air defense units. Disabling this radar is equivalent to shutting one of the eyes of Russia's air defense over Crimea. Ukraine's recent precision strikes on Crimean targets are made possible through these radar suppression operations. Because in modern aerial operations, a defense that cannot see is not a defense. The strike on the military railway infrastructure near Tokmak further highlights Ukraine's pressure on the logistical arteries of the war. Russia is heavily dependent on railroads to transport thousands of tons of ammunition and supplies across the vast front. Disabling the Tokmak rail line directly cuts this flow. Every delayed train means a delayed artillery shell or a delayed fuel tanker at the front. This creates a strategic opportunity for Ukraine. Russia's offensive tempo slows, coordination deteriorates, and more vulnerabilities appear on the battlefield. The targeting of Russian troop concentrations around Vovchansk is another link in this chain. At this stage of the war, Ukraine now has the reconnaissance capability to strike not only fixed facilities, but also moving troop groups. This directly affects the tactical balance on the ground, because Russian forces are becoming increasingly hesitant to conduct large-scale deployments. Large troop clusters have become easy targets within Ukraine's unmanned surveillance grid. This pushes the Russian army into an even more fragmented, vulnerable, and poorly coordinated structure. The strike on the Novorossiysk refinery in Samara and the targeting of the Rubicon drone depot clearly reveal Ukraine's strategic priorities, collapsing Russia's production and distribution infrastructure for unmanned systems. Ukraine knows that one of the most decisive factors shaping the outcome of this war is drone technology. Any disruption along Russia's production lines means fewer systems available on the battlefield. And this shifts the balance of unmanned competition in Ukraine's favor. The targeting of the military drone storage site and fuel transfer facility in the Donetsk axis follows the same logic. Ukraine is systematically striking not only Russia's interior, but every logistical node established in the occupied territories. The use of Bars jet drones in these operations demonstrates the level Ukraine's domestic production capacity has reached. With their long range and pinpoint precision, Bars drones prove that no geographic region in Russia is too far anymore. The most significant truth revealed by this chain of operations is this: Ukraine is no longer acting with a defensive reflex, but with offensive initiative. This multi-layered pressure line, stretching from energy infrastructure to radar networks, from railways to drone depots, undermines not only Russia's current warfighting capacity, but also its future planning. In modern warfare, success is not won solely on the front lines. Wearing down the enemy's economic and logistical backbone is equally decisive. This is exactly what Ukraine is doing today, and this is only the beginning. It is imposing deep pressure on the operational capacity of the Russian army, pressure that will produce even greater results in the coming weeks. Because Ukraine is now a force capable of reaching into the depths of the war. Now we will analyze how these operations translate to battlefield outcomes, particularly in connection with Ukraine's defensive successes along the Russia and Donetsk lines. While uncertainty caused by these attacks continues on the Russian side, one of the most striking developments on the ground occurred in the Donetsk axis, especially along the Russia line. The Russian troops planned an assault, assuming that the heavy fog would limit all reconnaissance capabilities on the battlefield. This was a commonly used tactic in classic Russian doctrine: reduce visibility, create surprise, exploit the weak point. But one thing was not calculated. Ukraine no longer needed to see in the traditional sense. Sensors, robotic reconnaissance systems, thermal tracking, and unmanned surveillance platforms rendered the fog completely meaningless. The defensive architecture built by the 93rd Kholodny Yar mechanized brigade in the area was remarkably sophisticated. Before the fog thickened, the brigade deployed ground-based robotic reconnaissance vehicles in a wide semicircle. These systems detected movement vibrations from approaching enemy elements and transmitted real-time data to the command center. Just minutes after the fog began, these vehicles identified the exact route of the advancing Russian armored group. The coordinates transmitted to the command center triggered simultaneous action by Ukrainian artillery batteries and FPV drone strike teams. The fog gave no concealment to Russia. Instead, it created an advantage for Ukraine. As the first wave of Russian troops attempted to advance, artillery strikes and FPV drones activated at the same moment. The vehicles they believed could safely approach under the fog were tagged one by thermal tracking systems. Ukraine's new generation FPV teams followed these tags in real time from the command center and directed their drones to targets within seconds. Despite the heavy fog, the infrared imaging capacity of drone cameras turned the battlefield into a clear daylight arena. The Russian assault column was scattered before it could even get close. The planned ambush became a failed attempt before it even started. According to data released by the General Staff, as of November 14th, a total of 107 assault attempts were stopped in Donetsk and its surrounding areas. This number is more than just a statistic. It is proof that Russia's multi-directional pressure strategy is no longer functional. The Kremlin wanted to break Ukrainian defenses by creating simultaneous pressure along different points of the front line, but the reality on the ground shows the opposite. Each attempt ends with greater losses, and because Russian forces are repeating the same tactics, Ukrainian defenses can anticipate these maneuvers and construct counter-strategies far more quickly. Developments along the Dorelia line reinforced this picture. The mechanized river crossing attempt over the Kazini Toret River was a typical example of Russia's effort to reduce the war to an engineering problem. But plans that work in theory can become disasters on the battlefield. Ukraine knows river crossings carry extreme risk and monitors every potential crossing point with a tight intelligence network. The outcome reflected this expertise. Russia lost 6 armored vehicles used to support the crossing. The crossing axis collapsed, and the advance attempt was completely halted. This loss once again exposed the tactical risk management failures within the Russian army. What is striking is this. Despite these losses, Russia is not giving up its broad front pressure strategy. But Ukraine's determined defense in the direction of Konstantin shows that Russia must now expend far more resources to maintain this pressure. By the nature of war, every failed assault attempt does not only mean casualties, it also carries enormous costs in morale, coordination, and logistical burden. Ukraine is continually increasing this cost for Russia on the battlefield. At this stage, Ukraine's proactive defense concept becomes unmistakably clear. Defense does not merely mean holding a position. It also means narrowing the enemy's decision-making space, restricting movement capability, reducing available options, and pushing them into repeating the same mistakes. What we are witnessing on the ground today is exactly this. Russian tactics have become predictable, while Ukraine is constructing a flexible and creative defense built on technology-driven solutions. Each of these successes demonstrates that Ukraine is not just resisting, it is setting the rhythm of the war, and that rhythm resonates at the diplomatic table as well. Each tactical victory strengthens the confidence of Western partners. This is why the historic defense package expected to be signed with France opens the door to a new phase that could influence the course of the war. To understand how battlefield successes translate into diplomatic outcomes, it is enough to look at the intense traffic between Paris and Kyiv in recent days. According to information confirmed by Élysée sources, the foundations of a historically scaled defense package between France and Ukraine have been laid. This package includes not only a new flow of munitions, but also a transformation program that will define Ukraine's future air power. During the Macron-Zelensky meeting scheduled for November 17th, a letter of intent is expected to be signed, with 2 critical items on the table: Rafale fighter jets and the SAMP/TNG air defense system. These 2 platforms have one thing in common: they directly affect both Russia's offensive capability and Ukraine's deterrence capacity. The Aster-30 B-1NT missiles of the SAMP/TNG system are particularly noteworthy. Designed to counter ballistic threats reaching up to 1,500 kilometers, this system is considered one of Europe's most advanced air defense solutions. Integrating such a capability into Ukraine would force Russia to fundamentally rethink its long-range strike planning. Many attack routes Moscow has relied on, until today, could become highly risky zones. The situation regarding Rafale fighter jets is more complex but full of potential. France's Air Force currently operates around 100 Rafales and has more than a 15% surplus in fleet capacity. Despite this, transferring existing aircraft to Ukraine in the short term is seen as unlikely, as it would reduce France's own operational flexibility. Thus, the scenario of Paris allocating newly produced Rafales for Ukraine is more realistic. Although production times, averaging 3 years, may delay deliveries, Dassau's effort to increase output from 3 to 5 aircraft per month signals that this process could accelerate. What matters here is that Ukraine is building not only for today, but for a long-term air power architecture. Zelensky's simultaneous negotiations on 3 platforms, F-16, Gripen, and Rafale, indicate that the country is aiming for a multi-platform air force suited to different mission profiles. F-16S will play a critical role in counter-air and precision strike operations. Gripens will excel in wide-area defense with low operating costs, and Rafales will offer multi-role capability in high-threat environments. This combination shows that Ukraine is acting with consideration not only for the current war, but for all future threats. Why have these diplomatic efforts accelerated now? The answer is simple. Success on the battlefield increases confidence at the negotiation table. Ukraine's determination across operations, extending from Pokrovsk to Crimea, from Ryazan to Tokmak, strengthened the perception in European capitals that Ukraine is not just defending this war, it is shaping it. Such a perception motivates even politically cautious states to act. No country wants to miss the opportunity to align itself with the strategically superior side. At the same time, the effects of Russia's logistical collapse have sharpened diplomatic calculations in Europe. China and Kazakhstan tightening grey import channels has restricted Russia's access to unmanned system components, medical equipment, and electronic hardware. As this pressure intensifies, Moscow's warfighting capacity will be strained even further. Every step taken by the West today is a direct investment in Ukraine's strength tomorrow. When we evaluate this picture as a whole, the conclusion becomes clear. Ukraine is gaining superiority not only by resisting on the battlefield, but by following a synchronized strategy across diplomacy, technology, production, and military planning. Russia, meanwhile, is being pushed into an increasingly defensive position, both on the battlefield and behind the scenes. And as this pressure intensifies, Ukraine's integration with the West accelerates. Ukraine's target of 250 new fighter jets is not simply a military project, it is a strategic investment at the heart of rebuilding Europe's security architecture. Once these aircraft arrive, Ukraine's air superiority will not only stop Russian attacks, it will fundamentally strengthen the security line of Eastern Europe. At this point, the fate of the war is being written not only on the dusty roads of the front line, but also at the diplomatic tables of Paris, the defense committees of Washington, and the production facilities of Europe. Ukraine's defensive elements on the battlefield are not merely one part of this grand picture. They are the embodiment of the will that holds the entire strategic framework together. And for this reason, we can comfortably say, Ukraine's journey is not merely a story of resistance. It is a transformative process that is redefining how modern wars are won. How do you think these developments will affect regional security? Share your thoughts in the comments. You can support our independent reporting by leaving a like on this broadcast. In our upcoming reports, we will continue to deliver the hottest developments from the field with in-depth analysis. The drone strike that took place last night in Russia's Oryol region became one of the clearest examples showing that the war is no longer confined to any single area. The operation targeting the combined heat and power plant once again reveals how systematically and decisively Ukraine has developed its deep strike capability. Local reports mention consecutive sounds heard around the facility and thick smoke rising from the area. These images represent not merely a technical attack, but a signal that Russia's energy backbone may now be within Kyiv's reach. The fact that Oryol is 160 to 170 kilometers from the Ukrainian border is the most concrete indicator of how long-range UAVs have turned into an effective platform. This distance reduces Russia's long-held claim that the front is far away, critical regions are safe, to almost a symbolic statement. As usual, Russia's air defense units announced they had shot down at least one drone, but the impact observed on the facility shows that the attack was largely effective. This is not just a technical vulnerability, it is a reflection of the growing defense gaps in various regions of Russia. The repeated targeting of energy infrastructure is part of a sustainable pressure strategy against one of the Kremlin's most sensitive domains. Because this is not the first time Oriol has been targeted. On November 5th, the same facility was struck, and on October 31st, a Neptune-class missile strike confirmed by the Ukrainian Navy disabled the region's open switchyard, causing significant technical disruptions in the broader area's energy flow. In other words, this is not just a single night operation, it is the continuation of a systematic attrition campaign. Ukraine's aim here is not merely to display technical superiority. Kyiv's strategy points to a much broader objective: to shatter the Russian society's long-held perception that the war is distant and that they are shielded from its consequences. One of the strongest tools the Kremlin has used to direct domestic public opinion is the idea that the effects of the war remain far from Russian regions. But Ukraine is tearing down this wall step by step. Attacks on energy facilities do not only mean lights going out, they mean the disruption of daily life, the stoppage of production lines, and the erosion of the population's sense of security. In other words, Ukraine is carrying the consequences of the war not only to the front line, but deep into Russia's own rear. The timing of these attacks is also noteworthy. As winter approaches, every intervention against Russia's energy infrastructure pushes the Kremlin into a more fragile position, both in the eyes of domestic public opinion and on the international stage. Because energy is not merely an economic element, it is also a political symbol. Through the Oriol strikes, Ukraine is reminding Russia of the following. Security is not ensured solely with tanks and rockets. What truly matters is how well a country can protect its own critical centers. And today, Russia is struggling to pass this test. The strategic message of the Oriol operation is quite clear. Ukraine is challenging the notion that Russia alone can dictate the pace of the war. By targeting facilities in border regions with high-precision platforms, Kyiv is invalidating Moscow's claim of being able to exert unilateral pressure. This situation also weakens the Kremlin's narrative that it maintains control over the war. Because if a country's internal energy centers are being targeted this frequently, the question of who truly holds control inevitably starts to be discussed among the public. Meanwhile, another major gain Ukraine achieves through these operations is forcing Russia to constantly revise its defense planning. Protecting strategic facilities like those in Oriol will require more resources, more personnel, and more equipment. This means that Russia will inevitably have fewer capabilities to allocate to the front line. Ukraine's strategy here is not to inflict direct destruction, but to create a systematic erosion that fragments Russia's ability to apply pressure. If this operational tempo continues, the daily order of life in Russia's border regions could shift rapidly. The Kremlin will no longer be able to tell its society, "The war is far from us." Because Ukraine has shortened the distance of the war. And this is not merely a military development, it is the beginning of a major transformation with psychological, economic, and political consequences. To better understand what this strike means in the broader picture, we must turn to another critical Russian region, Engels 2 Air Base, where unusual activity has recently been observed. The traces left by the Oriol operation, combined with the long lines of trucks reported at Engels, create a much larger image. Following the operation on the energy facility in Oriol, attention shifted to Engels 2, one of Russia's most critical military centers. Because Ukraine is not only targeting energy infrastructure on the battlefield, it is executing a multi-layered strategy aimed at Russia's deep strike capability used to set the tempo of the war. The unusual traffic observed at Engels 2 in recent days indicates that the Russian command has entered a new phase in both its defensive and offensive planning. Satellite imagery showing around 137 trucks points to something far beyond routine logistics activity. Such a large number of vehicles appearing simultaneously around the aircraft parking area suggests a critical preparation process or rapid repositioning effort. The AN-12 transport aircraft seen near the trucks makes the activity even more meaningful. The AN-12 is known for its capacity to carry heavy equipment. Its presence strengthens the possibility that these trucks are transporting munitions, spare parts, or equipment related to flight systems. Analyses shared on Russian military aviation telegram channels echo similar interpretations. This level of activity may be linked to operational preparations of bomber aircraft. These comments indicate that Russia may be attempting to reposition its long-range air power. Yet a major uncertainty remains. The Kremlin has not made any official statement, which increases speculation among observers. Here, the critical importance of Engels 2 becomes evident. This is one of the primary bases housing two 95 MS and two 160 strategic bombers, capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Su-34 and Su-35 tactical aircraft can also be present in this region. Therefore, any movement around the base matters not only for Russia's internal planning, but for international security dynamics as well. The infrastructural work conducted at the base in recent months makes this activity even more significant. Since October 2025, large-scale concrete pouring has been underway in the northern section, and a new strip parallel to the taxiways was completed on September 30th. Markings indicating the creation of 12 new parking positions have been detected in excavation areas. In other words, Russia is expanding its strategic aviation capacity and likely trying to create more operational space for long-range platforms. However, a critical contradiction emerges. While Russia expands the base, Ukraine is turning such facilities into more visible and more predictable targets. In modern warfare, the large surface area of fixed facilities makes them easier to track and easier to strike. The long-range unmanned systems Ukraine has developed over the past 2 years now place such bases within the category of accessible targets. Engels 2's expansion may be seen by Moscow as a display of strength, but for Kyiv, it means something different. The expansion makes the facility a more visible and exposed asset. The activity on the ground aligns with Russia's increased internal security reflexes. The strikes on energy facilities in Oriol have made the Kremlin more sensitive to long-range attacks. Thus, the rapid fortification of critical bases like Engels 2 can also be read as a defensive effort. But there is a problem. When defensive reinforcement and strategic expansion are pursued simultaneously, it strains Moscow's resource management. This is precisely the card Ukraine seeks to play, forcing Russia to divert resources to two different domains at the same time. For Ukraine, the notable opportunity here is that Engels 2 will remain an observable, active military activity zone for a while due to Russia's intense infrastructural work. Concrete pouring, excavation areas, construction materials, new parking positions, all of these increase the base's traceability. Fixed objects become open-source data, not only through radar imagery, but also via satellite images, signals intelligence, and thermal maps. This creates a highly valuable advantage for Ukraine's long-range planning. Looking at the entire picture, the following strategic conclusion emerges. The unusual intensity at Engels 2 may signal a period in which Russia is repositioning its long-range air power. But this movement also exposes the Kremlin's vulnerabilities. The larger the base becomes, the harder it is to defend. When combined with Ukraine's deep strike strategy, this reality transforms into a significant factor, eroding Russia's pressure capacity. In the coming days, every sound heard at this base, every truck spotted, every new infrastructure element recorded will become an important headline in the course of the war. Because in modern conflict, air bases are not merely points from which aircraft take off. They are the clearest mirrors reflecting a country's strategic intentions and vulnerabilities. The developments in the Donetsk region over the last 2 weeks demonstrate that the war is being fought not only with tanks on the front lines, but also in an invisible and often inaudible battleground. Ukraine's defense intelligence has been conducting a chain of operations that systematically disable the critical systems, forming the backbone of Russia's air defense, undermining both the Kremlin's military reflexes and its command and control structure. The tempo, precision, and deep infiltration capacity of these operations are a textbook example of how small, agile units can exert pressure on massive armies in modern warfare. Looking at the systems neutralized in the past 2 weeks, the situation clearly shifts in Ukraine's favor. The Tor M1 air defense system, the command center of the S-400's 55K6 unit, and the 9S-18M1-3 radar of the Buk M3. Each of these components was central to Russia's ability to detect, classify, and respond to air threats. The S-400's 55K6 command center in particular was known as one of the nerve nodes of Russia's most advanced air defense chain in the region. Its destruction means a major loss in situational awareness for the command network. In a war where responses to long-range threats are measured in seconds, such gaps create a critical turning point for Russia. Behind Ukraine's success lies an intelligence model that has moved beyond classical warfare logic. Small, fast, silent special units, drone networks built on high-resolution signal collection, satellite-supported targeting systems, and a centralized command structure integrating all these components. Thanks to this architecture, Ukraine is not only observing Russia's rear lines, but striking them from their least visible points. The common feature of these fast, pressure-driven operations in Donetsk is this: by the time Russian units notice what is happening, most of the operational advantage has already been secured. The strategic impact of these operations is felt immediately on the front line. The disabling of the Tor M1 significantly reduces Russia's ability to counter low-altitude threats. This system was primarily used against drones and low-flying munitions. The gap it leaves enables Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicles to move more freely over wider areas. The shutdown of the Buk M3 radar eliminates Russia's capacity to monitor medium-range threats, creating a major vulnerability in artillery coordination, troop mobility, and the security of supply lines. The neutralization of the S-400 command center has an even more critical effect. Russia has now lost part of its ability to anticipate long-range attacks along the Donetsk line. This pressure is not limited to technical losses alone. The Kremlin's military command structure is constantly confronted with the question, where will we rebuild the defense line? This restricts the Russian army's ability to take initiative, because before planning an attack, the state of the air defense network must be assessed. Yet due to Ukraine's rapid and precise operational tempo, Russia finds a new component disabled before it can complete these assessments. The result? Russia is constantly falling behind. What stands out here is that Ukraine is using these operations as a strategy to open space. As radars go silent, unmanned attack platforms can advance deeper. Drone swarms can conduct reconnaissance more freely. Targeting windows for long-range munitions expand. This strengthens the possibility that Ukraine may be preparing for larger operations on the Donetsk front in the coming period. Another important element is the psychological impact. Rumors spreading among Russian troops have nearly erased the concept of a safe zone. Knowing they can face an invisible strike even in rear areas creates a demoralizing atmosphere. Every radar loss, every command center destroyed, sends Russian soldiers the same message: nowhere is under control. Ukraine's surprise tempo based on these reports is gradually stripping Russia of its ability to determine the overall rhythm of the war. Because modern warfare progresses through a domino effect, When a radar falls, the surveillance chain collapses. When the chain collapses, the command network becomes confused. When the command network is confused, frontline planning falters. What is happening on the Donetsk axis today is exactly this. More importantly, the uninterrupted nature of these operations forces Russia into a strategic choice. Either it will accept these losses and shrink its defensive line, or it will risk more personnel and equipment to compensate. Both options are challenging for the Kremlin. The pressure that began with the fragmentation of the radar chain in Donetsk has spilled not only onto the battlefield, but also into the regional security architecture. Because the war is no longer confined to Ukrainian territory. It is progressing with a risk map stretching from the Black Sea to the Balkans, from the Romanian border to Turkish ports. Recent events show that Russia is directing its naval and air assets onto an increasingly reckless trajectory, producing consequences that reach all the way to NATO's doorstep. The danger caused by a Russian UAV near a gas tanker off the Ukrainian coast pushed Romanian authorities to issue an emergency evacuation decision. Security units in the region enacted a temporary relocation of personnel stationed at a point near the border. This marks the first time Russian attacks have required a concrete evacuation in the border area of a NATO member state. Europe views this as a strategic threshold event, because Moscow's strikes now threaten not only Ukrainian infrastructure, but the entire logistical and energy circulation of the region. In the same period, a Turkish LPG tanker was struck in the port of Ismail, causing operational disruptions and demonstrating how wide the danger has spread. These types of targets put pressure not only on military actors, but also on economic arteries, energy transit routes, and critical trade corridors of NATO allies. It is clear that the attacks along the Ukrainian coastline point to a shared strategy. Russia is systematically raising the risk level in the Black Sea. While the goal appears to be economically strangling Ukraine, the consequences affect a far larger geography. Here, the assessments of European security experts are striking. Russia's increased pressure over the Black Sea is forcing not only Ukraine, but also NATO members, such as Romania and Bulgaria, to reassess their naval security doctrines. Because this escalation carries the potential risk of impacting NATO territory, especially in cases of miscalculation or loss of control. This has raised Europe's alarm level. Russia's own internal rhetoric moves parallel to this risky trajectory. The sharp statements made by Russian Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov on television and his subsequent "I was joking" defense show the type of rhetorical policy the Kremlin pursues to keep the nationalist base energized. When Russia's provocative domestic language converges with international escalation, regional uncertainty grows further. Another noteworthy development is the recent circulation in Russian media of claims that an alleged assassination attempt on Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had been foiled. There is no concrete evidence, no official confirmation. Yet the Kremlin continues to steer public opinion with such reports. These allegations aim to create a perception of siege from within, tying the public more tightly to wartime policies. But experts note that with no real-world basis, these narratives are interpreted as a strategy by the Kremlin to manipulate public perception. On top of all this comes the statement by the chairman of the Russian State Duma's Defense Committee, the declaration of NATO as a potential enemy. This rhetoric indicates that Moscow is officially designating the West as a direct threat in its doctrine. The same statement's emphasis that the Ukrainian army is the primary threat suggests that the Kremlin's rhetoric is shifting toward a harsher line. These statements are not coincidental. As Russia becomes increasingly isolated internationally, it sharpens its language. Statements from Europe and the United States, however, paint a completely different picture. French President Emmanuel Macron's remark, "Russia chose this war and insists on continuing it," clearly reflects the Western perspective on responsibility for the conflict. Macron's emphasis that attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure prove Russia's peace intentions are entirely false confirms that Europe is moving toward a new diplomatic stance toward Moscow. Another conclusion highlighted in Europe's strategic analyses is this: Russia is pursuing an escalation policy across wide regions to compensate for battlefield pressures, but this strategy is working against it in the long run, because every tension occurring on NATO's border increases European and American support for Ukraine. Russia's aggressive moves are not intimidating the West as expected. On the contrary, they are fostering unity. This complex picture, from the Black Sea to Romania, from Turkish ports to Ukrainian shores, makes Ukraine's strategic goals clearer. Ukraine is no longer merely resisting at the front. It is pursuing a multi-layered policy aimed at neutralizing Russia's regional pressure mechanisms. Now we turn to how this regional turbulence reflects at the diplomatic table and what kind of leadership Ukraine demonstrates in this process. As tensions rise on the battlefield, the diplomatic arena is just as active, because Ukraine is now managing not only the military aspect of the war, but also the sustainability of international support, prisoner exchanges, humanitarian corridors, and allied coordination, all simultaneously. And a concrete example of this multi-layered strategy emerged in recent days. National Security and Defense Council Secretary Rustem Umerov announced that preparations were underway for a new prisoner exchange that could bring 1,200 Ukrainians home by the end of the year. This initiative is not just a diplomatic step, it is a reflection of Ukraine's moral advantage in the international arena, earned by protecting humanitarian principles even during war. Umerov noted that the negotiations were being conducted through the Istanbul format, bringing Turkey's mediating role back into focus. Turkey holds a unique position as a bridge between the parties in Black Sea security and humanitarian issues. Ukraine's decision to highlight this format in its diplomatic efforts is an important extension of Kyiv's multi-directional diplomacy throughout the war. The very existence of such talks signals Russia's growing isolation internationally, as Moscow struggles today to secure open and direct support from major power centers. This is another factor strengthening Ukraine's hand. Looking at the situation on the ground, analysts note that Russia's strategic pressure policy is expanding. Attacks on energy facilities, moves that endanger Black Sea traffic, risky actions directly affecting NATO states such as Romania and Turkey. All of these illustrate the Kremlin's effort to turn the war into a regional pressure tool. But contrary to expectations, this strategy is not weakening Ukraine. On the contrary, it is pushing Europe and the United States toward even firmer support for Kyiv. Assessments in European security circles are clear. Russia cannot gain ground by destabilizing the international order. Because Europe's energy security, NATO's eastern flank, and maritime traffic in the Black Sea have become strategic priorities that cannot be manipulated by the Kremlin. For this reason, military and economic support to Ukraine continues to grow. Experts believe that as this pressure intensifies, Russia's strategic expansion goals will evolve into an increasingly inward-facing trajectory. Its aggressive moves are backfiring both on the ground and diplomatically. Standing in contrast is Ukraine's increasingly strong multi-layered strategy. By targeting energy facilities, Ukraine undermines Russia's internal sense of security. By striking radar chains in Donetsk, it weakens the Kremlin's military coordination capacity. It manages the Black Sea tension cautiously but resolutely, while simultaneously playing an active role at the diplomatic table on prisoner exchanges, international sanctions, and emerging partnership opportunities. This multi-dimensional approach shows that Ukraine is gaining strategic weight not only on the battlefield, but also on the global stage. Three critical outcomes for the upcoming period stand out. First, Russia's pressure strategy is generating a pro-Ukraine unity effect in both Europe and NATO. The Kremlin's aggressive moves are not causing the West to back down. They are reinforcing political determination. Second, Ukraine's long-range strike capability and intelligence success are making Russia's domestic propaganda structure fragile. the perception of a distant war is no longer valid for Russian regions. Third, the acceleration of diplomatic contacts gives Ukraine broader maneuvering space, not only militarily, but also in humanitarian and political domains. The most important truth to remember in this process is the following. The fate of the war is not determined solely by tanks and drones. Logistics routes, energy security, international alliances, political pressures, and even economic sanctions are inseparable elements of modern warfare. Today, Ukraine has become one of the rare countries capable of managing all these components as an integrated whole. This makes Kyiv not only resilient, but also a strategically foresighted actor. The current situation shows that Russia's expected show of force is increasingly failing, and the rhythm of the war is shifting in Ukraine's favor. The combination of battlefield pressure, diplomatic achievements, and international support is narrowing the Kremlin's room for maneuver while giving Ukraine the advantage. So what do you think? As Russia continues this coercive strategy, will Ukraine's gains in diplomacy and on the battlefield grow even further? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like to support our independent news coverage. The recent clashes on the Pokrovsk line clearly show that Ukraine is conducting its in-region defense not merely with a reflex to protect, but with an operational vision. Russian units attempted to reuse in this area the infiltration and raid tactics that had already failed in Divka and Bakhmut. The model is the same: small assault teams directed into narrow zones, armored support following behind, and the expectation of sudden pressure. But the battlefield no longer responds to these old templates. As a result of years of experience and modernization, Ukraine not only defends against such attacks, it disrupts the plan itself and turns it into an opportunity for a counter-move. The latest example of this was seen in the operation carried out by the 425th Skila Regiment in a critical zone at the regional center. Russia's attempt to establish a temporary contact point was quickly rendered futile. Ukrainian forces applied coordinated pressure, cleared the area, and restored full control. This development became one of the clearest signs explaining why Russia's attempt to build pressure on Pokrovsk has not progressed. Another infiltration attempt detected by reconnaissance elements on the western side of the city ended just as quickly. The Ukrainian assault team moved to the area as soon as the information arrived, and the Russian group was neutralized before it could establish a position. The critical point on the ground here was not only speed, but also the ability to conduct instant risk analysis. A Russian FPV drone trying to track the movement of the vehicles was taken out due to the team's brief halt and the correct countermeasure. Although the drone threat has become an ordinary element of modern warfare, the calm manner in which Ukrainian units manage this threat shows the high level of tactical intelligence on the ground. Russia's plan to gain a surveillance advantage failed once again, because Ukrainian units are not only detecting threats, they are succeeding in taking them out of the game. Following this contact, Ukrainian air elements came into play and applied heavy pressure on the areas where the infiltrating Russian teams were located. As the pressure increased, Russian soldiers retreated to shelters, but this withdrawal was not a tactical regrouping. It showed that the outcome of the operation would no longer change. When the ground units arrived, an area control operation began. Standard close-range procedures were carried out along the contact lines, followed by a cautious entry. This professional touch reflected all the requirements of in-region combat. All enemy elements in the position were neutralized. 2 remaining individuals attempted to reposition in a different location. However, at this point, both the pursuit team and the Vampire unmanned system, frequently used in regional operations, came into play. The system's surveillance capacity and targeting precision completely nullified the escape attempt. When the operation was completed, the picture was very clear. Pokrovsk is still under Ukrainian control, and Russia's chances of achieving the progress it wants in this region are increasingly diminishing. This is not merely the result of a single clash. It is part of a broader portrait illustrating the evolving nature of the war. Russia's plan to create gaps through small raids collapses the moment it hits Ukraine's defense architecture. Because Ukraine is no longer the side that only defends. It is the side that reads the battlefield and sets the tempo of the game. The defensive networks established within the settlement, the flow of intelligence, the rapid response to drone threats, and the ability to correctly manage the psychological dimension of operations show why Ukraine remains so resilient. Today, the situation in Pokrovsk is not just about the control of a region. It is a message that reveals how modernized Ukraine has become in the course of the war. Russia hopes to achieve results by repeating the same tactics, but it faces a defensive understanding that has learned from the past, is compatible with technology, and is determined. The fact that Pokrovsk has not fallen shows not only that Ukraine is resisting, but that it has also established an intelligent tempo. There is one more element completing this picture. When these frontline successes are combined with the complex operations carried out at sea, it becomes clear that the war has taken on a multidimensional character. Now it is time to turn our eyes to the Black Sea. What happened during the multi-layered naval operation carried out by Ukrainian defense intelligence? The developments in the Black Sea in recent weeks show that the war is no longer limited to the land front. Ukraine has also assumed a game-shaping role at sea. The multi-layered operation carried out by the Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, GUR, was not merely a move to disable a radar system. It was a turning point in which regional naval superiority was strategically redefined. The official completion date of the operation was recorded as September 21st, but the details emerging in early October revealed how broad and meticulously planned the mission was. Ukraine's objective was simple: to reduce Russia's surveillance capacity over the Black Sea and create a safer operational environment for other unmanned platforms operating in the field. But the execution was highly sophisticated, a complex mission profile integrating surface, subsurface, and aerial elements simultaneously. In the first phase of the mission, Ukraine's Katran X-1 and X-3 naval drones took the stage. These platforms were not only carriers, but also the main elements managing the command logic of the operation. Each Katran carried a total of 9 FPV drones and 4 fixed-wing loitering munitions. But the truly critical component of the operation was the long-range smart torpedo carried by each Katran, long-range, high-effect modules that advanced to a waiting position. This maneuver demonstrated that Ukraine operates effectively not only against surface threats, but also against underwater threats. Although there have been indications that such torpedoes were used before, the models remain classified, making the technical aspect of the operation even more striking. Once the Katran platforms pulled back to a safe distance, the operation continued with support from the air. To ensure communication continuity, the task force deployed a relay drone. This step was decisive in preventing Russian electronic warfare elements from disrupting the operation. Because in modern warfare, a communication breakdown is not just a technical issue, it is a risk that blurs the entire operational line. Ukraine prevented this risk and moved on to the most critical phase of the operation, disabling the radar system at the target point. The radar system Russia had installed, built on a reconnaissance platform modified for military purposes to enhance detection capability over the Black Sea, was one of the region's eyes. First, the effect created by the torpedoes weakened the structural integrity of the platform. This sudden shock forced Russian defense personnel onto the open deck, and at that very moment, FPV systems disabled the defense line. At the same time, loitering platforms were directed at the antenna, taking the system out of operation. Thus, not only a platform, but an important link in the pressure mechanism Moscow was trying to establish in the region, was neutralized. This success was not limited to the destruction of a local target. Following the silencing of the radar, Ukraine created the groundwork for another move. The Nebo-U radar system deployed over Crimea became more vulnerable due to the blindness created by this operation. Continued strikes resulted in the Nebo-U also being taken out of operation. In other words, a maritime action carried out by GUR triggered a second chain disruption in the airspace. This is one of the strongest examples of Ukraine's multi-layered approach that connects targets within modern war doctrine. The mission did not end there. In the final phase of the operation, Novorossiysk's unmanned attack vehicles came into play. Advancing from the south, these vehicles struck an oil facility located in the port of Novorossiysk. This move clearly revealed a strategic outcome for Russia. Ukraine is not only defending, it has the capacity to apply pressure on every point of strategic infrastructure. The balance of power in the Black Sea is changing in a way that will not return to its former state. The broad coverage in international media confirms that Ukraine, through its unmanned naval systems, is reshaping the regional game. The truth revealed by this operation is very clear. Ukraine has consolidated its operational superiority on the maritime front. According to analysts, Russia's surveillance network in the region is under pressure. Experts believe this situation may influence the overall strategic balance. Now we will move to the implications of this operation on international diplomacy and air power architecture. Because operational developments are also shaping diplomatic processes. On the Ukrainian side, the steps taken at the diplomatic table have become one of the main elements determining the course of the war, just as much as the operations on the ground. Especially the negotiations on the modernization of the Air Force show that Kyiv's long-term defense vision is taking shape. One of the most important components of this vision is the new defense agreement to be signed with France, which Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has described as historic. Zelensky will be received in Paris on November 17th by French President Emmanuel Macron, and the two countries will sign a comprehensive cooperation package that will significantly strengthen Ukraine. This step is not only about supplying new aircraft, it is also a sign that an Air Force architecture built to NATO standards is being constructed for Ukraine. Among the information discussed in recent weeks, the possibility of Rafale aircraft entering the Ukrainian inventory stands out. Rafale, one of the most advanced multi-role fighter jets in the world, is not just a platform. With its superior avionics, long-range sensors, and multi-mission profiles, it is a system capable of completely reshaping a nation's air doctrine. The manufacturer Dassault announced publicly that they are open to potential cooperation with Ukraine. This signal emphasized that Zelensky has entered a new phase in the structuring of Ukraine's air power. However, how many aircraft will be provided, the delivery intervals, and the timetable on which the training processes will be carried out remain issues awaiting clarity at the negotiation table. Zelensky's earlier remarks, in which he stated that simultaneous negotiations were underway with 3 different countries, also carry significant weight. These countries are Sweden, the United States, and France. The topics under discussion are Gripen with Sweden, F-16 with the US, and Rafales with France. This picture shows that Ukraine is planning to build a multi-layered, multi-role and flexible air power structure rather than relying on a single platform. Such a structure allows for various combinations capable of creating tactical advantages at every stage of the war. For example, Gripen aircraft stand out with their low operating costs and short runway capabilities, offering flexible use in complex operational environments. When these 3 platforms come together, Ukraine's Air Force not only becomes modernized, it transforms into a structure that is fully integrated with Europe's security fabric. Although it is known that France offered Rafales to Ukraine in 2021, the process was suspended at that time. But today, the circumstances have changed. France's increasing political support for Ukraine, Europe's determination to expand its defense architecture against the Russian threat, and the developments on the ground have accelerated the revival of such projects. Moreover, this agreement is not limited to aircraft sales alone. Strengthening air defense networks, modernizing radar and command and control infrastructure, and expanding pilot training programs are among the many subtopics on the table. This means that Ukraine is on the path to building a self-sustaining air power structure in the future. For Ukraine, there is another crucial aspect of this process: the visible emergence of integration with the West in the military domain. the fact that EU and NATO countries are beginning to view Ukraine as a partner in defense industry projects undermines the pressure policy the Kremlin has attempted to impose for years. Because as Russia's military posture in the region becomes harsher, Ukraine's strategic ties with its allies grow even stronger. A defense agreement signed today paves the way for more extensive joint production projects, training bases, and technology transfers tomorrow. As Zelensky has repeatedly emphasized, Ukraine's international support network has clearly strengthened. This feeling of not being alone provides morale to soldiers on the battlefield and strength at the diplomatic table. These developments also mark a critical turning point for Europe's security architecture. France's move to sign an air power agreement with Ukraine indicates that a more collective attitude is forming within the European Union in the field of defense. This is proof that the long-discussed concept of a joint European defense capability is now beginning to be implemented in practice. As the clashes on the ground continue, the acceleration of air power modernization creates new risks for Russia as well. A significant portion of the Russian Air Force is now struggling to counter modern threats. The arrival of platforms such as Rafale, F-16 and Gripen in Ukrainian hands would create a deterrence capability that could invalidate Russia's attack plans even at the conceptual stage. Now the picture is becoming clear. Ukraine is building an air architecture not only to survive today, but to shape the future. Once this architecture is complete, the air dimension of the war will be elevated to an entirely different level. Now we will analyze how Russia's internal socio-economic disintegration intersects with this military picture. Wars are won or lost not only through frontline clashes, but also through fractures emerging within a country's internal structure. The socio-economic situation unfolding in Russia's distant regions shows that Moscow can no longer conceal the realities it has tried to hide for years. One of the most symbolic examples is the regional picture, an enormous economic center where the world's largest diamond reserves and strategically vital minerals such as gold and uranium are extracted. In theory, this region should have been one of Russia's economic engines. Some analysts even argued for years that it had the potential to become the Dubai of the North. Yet today, the situation in the region points to the exact opposite of these aspirations. It clearly shows how crises in the local logistics network have deepened when combined with external sanctions. Reports indicate that the local supply chain is steadily deteriorating. These images reflect not only profound economic difficulties, but also the Kremlin's long-standing strategic failures in resource management. Because if it cannot even maintain regional service capacity, the issue is not merely economic hardship. It raises serious questions about the sustainability of the administrative structure. Instead of channeling Russia's vast natural resource revenues into public welfare, the Kremlin has directed them toward propaganda apparatuses and the war economy, fueling growing dissatisfaction at home. The Kremlin believed it could continue the war without burdening the public, but the situation is changing. This wave of dissatisfaction is not only an economic reaction, but also a signal of political rupture. Analysts highlight a crucial point. Although the region historically had limited growth dynamics, the fact that even basic living necessities have become a crisis has pushed the patience threshold to its limits. Another reason for the regional collapse is Moscow's redirection of resources to the battlefield by cutting local budgets. Local administrative units are said to be affected by budget reductions. Declining living standards in a region with immense production potential, such as this one, sharply reveal the Kremlin's priorities. It is evident that the Kremlin's focus has shifted toward operational areas. These images are not only discussed inside Russia. EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs Josep Borrell stated in his remarks that Russia is far from seeking negotiations, highlighting that every ceasefire call from the international community is met with new missile strikes by Russia. These statements show how isolated the Kremlin has become in foreign policy, because an actor that cannot inspire trust at the diplomatic table cannot escape domestic economic problems. Sooner or later, these problems return as political pressure. The recent joint call by G7 foreign ministers confirms this. An international front demanding an immediate ceasefire has formed. These calls are not merely an appeal for peace, they signal that economic and diplomatic pressure on Russia will intensify further. While Russia's export routes, its economic backbone, are already severely damaged by sanctions, the decline in the domestic economic structure is affecting societal sentiment. Although the Kremlin is attempting to manipulate this picture through strengthened propaganda mechanisms, it can no longer conceal the realities on the ground. The regional situation in the east shows the following. A significant portion of Russia's remaining resources is being directed toward operations on the battlefield. This creates an unsustainable model. As the war drags on, this collapse will deepen, and combined with Ukraine's resilience, Moscow's room for maneuver will shrink even further. This internal collapse indirectly affects Russia's military capacity on the battlefield as well. As the economic burden grows, the quality of resources allocated to the army declines, military morale deteriorates, and the vulnerability of logistical networks increases. This situation creates a breaking point that can further amplify Ukraine's battlefield advantages. And now it is time to examine how this internal collapse is reflected within the Russian military, how Russia's manpower crisis, internal discord, and morale loss are shaping events on the ground. One of the most important indicators that goes beyond the military dimension of war is the structural problems armies face regarding manpower. The situation facing the Russian army today shows exactly this. A structure with internal cohesion broken, internal conflict, inappropriate behavior from foreign mercenary elements, and a collapse in morale. Recent videos from the field showing Russian units clashing with foreign mercenaries, exhibiting internal incompatibility and lack of respect, are not isolated incidents. They are clear evidence of how much the army's overall discipline standards have eroded. These individuals are elements Moscow brought in to fill its manpower gap. But what they encounter is not a military order, but a structure plagued by increasing coordination problems. Fighting in such an atmosphere does nothing but accelerate moral collapse. These images clearly show that commentators believe Russia's military discipline structure has weakened, giving way to an uncontrolled, fragmented, and internally inconsistent force. Assessments indicate that Russia has suffered serious losses since the beginning of the war, and the overburdening of disciplinary centers, authority gaps among commanders, and even volunteer units failing to coordinate with each other have accelerated the army's fragmentation. The pressure directed at mercenaries is, in fact, a reflection of the military's internal inability to resolve its own problems. Such behavior is known to harm operational performance on the battlefield, weaken the chain of command, and create major disruptions in military decision-making processes. In contrast, Ukraine is writing a very different story. The resilience, morale, and coordination of units operating on the field are strikingly strong. The announcement last week that a single soldier successfully completed 6 different rescue missions reveals the operational tempo and personal sacrifice of the Ukrainian military. This is not merely a military success story, it is a reflection of the shared resilience between society and the armed forces. For Ukrainian soldiers, every mission is not simply an operation, it is a struggle to protect the country's future. This motivation makes all strategic planning on the battlefield more effective. Ukraine's ability to maintain this high level of morale and resilience is underpinned by continuous Western support, the acceleration of modernization, and the united resolve of society. Training, equipment, and strategic assistance provided by Europe and the United States strengthen the Ukrainian army not only in numbers, but in overall capability. Combined with Russia's deepening domestic economic issues, this support is shifting the momentum of the war increasingly in Ukraine's favor. When we evaluate today's picture as a whole, 3 main dynamics emerge that will determine the fate of the war: internal pressures and systemic issues faced by Russia, Ukraine's resilience on the battlefield, and the West's strategic support. These three factors are not independent of each other. On the contrary, they interact and reinforce one another. As Russia's logistical and economic constraints grow, its operational capacity on the front declines. Meanwhile, Ukraine is accelerating its military modernization and securing a stronger position on the international stage. Therefore, the real question regarding the future course of the conflict is this: how much longer can Russia withstand this pressure? At this point, increasing pressures and difficulties within Russia's domestic front and internal structures are becoming more apparent. In contrast, Ukraine, despite all challenges, continues to stand firm with its modernizing structure and growing international support. This difference is expected to have significant impacts on the progression of the war. And now, we turn to our viewers. Do you think the decline in morale and motivation within the Russian army and Ukraine's model of resilience could create a decisive turning point in the course of the war? Share your thoughts in the comments. We are curious to hear your analyses as well. By leaving a like on this broadcast, you can support our independent journalism dedicated to telling the story of Ukraine's just struggle. We'll be here with new developments as they unfold. We will continue bringing you all the behind-the-scenes details of the war, diplomacy, and strategic balances. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We wish you days of peace.